They say a wedding day should be about love and celebration. My sister's wedding became the day my entire family tried to bury me alive in front of 200 guests. My name is Gillian. I'm 37, and I gave up my career in marketing to care for my dying mother, while my younger sister Lydia climbed the corporate ladder on ideas that weren't entirely her own. But I didn't know that yet. At the reception, amid free-flowing champagne and camera flashes, Lydia grabbed my arm and dragged me across the ballroom to meet her boss, a distinguished man named Mr. Greason. With a smile that could cut glass, she announced loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear, "This is my sister, the unemployed loser." The laughter started immediately. My father, never one to miss an opportunity, joined the chorus. "She's the shame of our family. Threw away a good career for nothing." I stood there frozen as my entire worth was reduced to a punchline at my sister's wedding. The room spun. My hands went numb. I wanted to disappear, but then something unexpected happened. Mr. Gryson looked at my sister with an expression I couldn't decipher. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then he spoke, his voice quiet, but utterly final. "You're fired." The ballroom fell completely silent, and as security escorted my sister Lydia out of her own wedding reception, Mr. Greason pressed something into my hand, a business card with a message that would change everything. "Your mother saved my daughter's life once. Call me on Monday." That's when I realized this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the biggest comeback they never saw coming. My name is Gillian Lowe. I'm 37 years old, and 3 years ago, I walked away from a promising career as a marketing director to do something most people would consider noble. I moved back home to care for my dying mother. What no one tells you about noble sacrifices is that the world doesn't stop and wait for you. It just keeps moving. And when you're ready to step back in, you find your place has been given to someone else. The invitation to my younger sister Lydia's wedding arrived on thick, cream-colored card, with gold detailing the kind of stationery that whispered money and status. I held it in my hands for a long time, feeling its weight, wondering if I could really go. Lydia and I hadn't been close for years, not since our mother's illness revealed the cracks in our family that had always been there, just hidden beneath polite holiday dinners and obligatory birthday cards. But she was still my sister, and a part of me. The part that remembered braiding her hair when she was 6, teaching her to ride a bike, standing up for her against primary school bullies. That part couldn't imagine not being there on her wedding day. So I went to buy a dress I couldn't afford. I found it in a discount shop, marked down twice a simple navy blue sheath dress, presentable enough without drawing too much attention. I paired it with shoes I already owned, the heels of which were slightly worn on the left side from the way I walk. When I looked in the mirror that Saturday morning, I saw a woman held together by sheer willpower and cheap mascara, trying desperately to look like she belonged in a world that had moved on without her. The wedding venue was one of those historic estates that are rented out for events that cost more than some people make in a year. Marble columns framed the entrance. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light, casting rainbows on walls adorned with oil paintings of people who had been dead for centuries. Everywhere I looked, I saw excess elaborate floral arrangements taller than I was, ice sculptures, sweating in the warm June air. White-gloved waiters carrying trays of champagne in flutes that probably cost more than my dress. I immediately felt out of place, like a smudge on a flawless photograph. The ceremony was beautiful, in that impersonal way expensive weddings often are. Lydia was stunning in a gown that probably cost as much as a used car. Her blonde hair swept into an elaborate style that must have taken hours. Our father walked her down the aisle with his chest puffed out, proud as a peacock, never once glancing over to where I sat alone in the third row. Our stepmother dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, playing the part of the emotional maternal figure she had never been to either of us. I clapped when I was supposed to clap. I smiled when people looked my way. I accepted the single glass of champagne offered during the cocktail hour and made it last for 45 minutes, sipping slowly because I knew I couldn't afford to lose control of my emotions. Not here. Not today. The reception was held in a ballroom that could have housed a small aeroplane. Round tables draped in silk surrounded a dance floor that gleamed like still water. A live band played on a stage, decorated with enough flowers to supply a funeral home for a month. I found my place card at a table near the back, wedged between a cousin I hadn't seen in 10 years and an empty chair that apparently no one had bothered to fill. I was picking at a salad that cost more than my weekly food budget when Lydia found me. She had changed out of her ceremony gown into a shorter, sleeker dress that showed off her figure. And her tan, the kind of tan you get from beach holidays, I couldn't remember the last time I'd been able to afford. Her smile was bright and brittle as she gripped my wrist with fingers that glittered with her new wedding rings. "Gillian, there you are hiding in the corner," she said, her voice having that particular edge that meant she'd had several glasses of champagne and was feeling bold. "Come on. I want you to meet someone important." Before I could protest, she was pulling me through the ballroom, weaving between tables where guests turned to watch their conversations, stopping mid-sentence. I felt their eyes on my cheap dress, my worn shoes, my hair that I had done myself that morning because a trip to the salon was a luxury I could no longer justify. We stopped in front of a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s, tall with silvering hair, wearing a suit that fit him in a way that only bespoke tailoring can. He was in mid-conversation with another guest, but as Lydia approached, he turned to us with the kind of polite attention powerful people have perfected. "Mr. Grayson," Lydia said, her voice too loud, too shrill. "I want you to meet my sister." She made a grand gesture in my direction, and then she said the words that would be burned into my memory forever. "This is Gillian, my unemployed failure of a sister." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around us, I heard laughter, sharp, uncomfortable titters from guests who weren't sure if it was a joke, but laughed anyway because Lydia was the bride, and the bride gets to set the tone. My face grew hot. My throat closed up. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there as the room spun around me. And then my father's voice cut through the noise, loud and clear and devastating. "She's the shame of our family," he announced, walking over to join us, our stepmother on his arm. "Threw away a good career for nothing. We tried to tell her, but she never listens." The laughter grew louder. Someone whispered something I couldn't quite hear, but I caught the words, "What a shame," and "wasted potential." My hands were shaking. I felt as if someone had wrapped steel bands around my ribs and was tightening them, squeezing until I couldn't expand my lungs enough to take a breath. I stood there, paralyzed and exhibit, as my own family, my own blood, reduced me to a punchline at what was supposed to be a celebration of love. Mr. Gryson's expression was impossible to read. He looked at me, really looked at me, his dark eyes taking in my face, my dress, the way I was holding myself together by a thread. A thick, excruciating silence settled, as everyone waited to see how this important man would react to being drawn into this awkward family situation. Then he turned to Lydia. "You're fired," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it echoed through the ballroom like a crack of thunder. "Effective immediately. We don't employ people who lack basic human decency." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a champagne bubble pop. Lydia's face went from flushed to chalk white in an instant. "What, Mr. Gryson, that was just... I was joking." "I don't find cruelty amusing, Mrs. Hart," he said. using her new married name with something that sounded almost like contempt, especially not cruelty directed at family members who have apparently sacrificed their careers to provide care that you clearly couldn't be bothered with. On Monday, security will escort you and your belongings from our offices. Your final pay will be sent in the post. He made a gesture to someone I couldn't see, and within seconds, two men in dark suits appeared. They weren't hotel security. They were his personal security. I realized the kind of protection that comes with real wealth and power. My father tried to intervene. Now see here, there's been a misunderstanding. Gryson held up a hand, silencing him instantly. There has been no misunderstanding. I understand perfectly. Good evening. As the security team led a stunned, silent Lydia towards the ballroom exit, still in her reception dress, her face a mask of shock and dawning horror, Gryson turned to me. He stepped close enough that only I could hear him, and pressed something small and rectangular into my palm. Your mother saved my daughter's life once, he said quietly, a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there moments before. Call me on Monday. Then he was gone, disappearing back into the crowd of shocked guests, leaving me standing there with a business card burning in my hand, and the entire ballroom staring at me with expressions that ranged from pity to admiration to thinly veiled delight at the drama they had just witnessed. That business card felt like a bomb in my pocket. I had no idea it was about to detonate my entire world. I slipped out of the wedding venue while the chaos was still unfolding in the ballroom, escaping through a side door before anyone could corner me with questions, or worse, pity. My car was parked in the furthest corner of the car park, right where I'd deliberately left it that morning. A 12-year-old saloon with a dent in the rear bumper and an engine warning light that had been on for 3 months. I couldn't afford to get it fixed, so I'd learned to ignore it the same way I'd learned to ignore so many other things in my life that needed attention. The engine turned over on the second try, and I pulled out onto the dark country lane leading away from the estate. I had no destination in mind. Going home felt impossible back to the small flat that still smelled faintly of my mother's lavender sachets filled with the furniture from a life I used to have. So I just drove, letting muscle memory guide me down roads I'd known since childhood. The A road took me past my secondary school, the place where it had all started to unravel. I was 16 when I'd won the regional scholarship competition with my essay on social innovation in marketing. The prize was £15,000 towards university and an internship at a prestigious firm in the city. I remember coming home with the acceptance letter, my hands shaking with excitement, already imagining the future stretching out before me like a golden path. My father took the letter from my hands, read it slowly, then placed it on the kitchen table with a sigh that told me everything before he even spoke. Your sister will be applying for this same scholarship next year, he'd said, not looking at me. If you take it now, it will hurt her chances. They don't like to give it to siblings 2 years in a row. Do you understand? I didn't understand. I was 16 and I had earned this, worked for this, deserved this. But my mother had been there too, standing by the stove, her eyes full of something I couldn't name then, but now recognized as a helpless apology. My father made it clear that taking the scholarship would be selfish, that family meant sacrifice, that Lydia needed it more because she wasn't as naturally gifted and needed the extra boost to compete. So I turned it down. I watched Lydia accept that same scholarship the following year. I watched her give a speech about perseverance and hard work. I watched my parents beaming with pride in the audience, while I sat in the back row, wondering what kind of perseverance I'd shown by giving up. The road curved past the local college where I'd ended up for my first 2 years. Because when I was 18, the university fund our grandparents had set up for both of us had mysteriously dried up. My father explained it all away with charts and graphs. I didn't understand something about market fluctuations and unexpected expenses. Lydia went straight to a private university on a full ride, paid for by the family, which had apparently become solvent again right after my funding fell through. I pulled the car over onto a side street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Memory after memory flooded my mind like scattered photographs from a dropped album. I was 13, getting straight A's, and my father said, "Boys don't like clever girls, Gillian. You should focus on being more sociable." Lydia brought home B's and C's and was praised for her people skills. I was 25, about to give my first major client presentation. I'd called home excited, and my stepmother, who had entered our lives when I was 19, 6 months after my parents' bitter divorce, said, "That's nice, dear. Lydia just got engaged. Isn't that wonderful?" Every achievement, every milestone, every moment that should have been mine was overshadowed by Lydia's repackaged as proof that she was the daughter worth celebrating. At a red light, my phone buzzed insistently from my handbag. I pulled it out, and the screen lit up my face in the darkness of the car. 47 unread messages. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I scrolled through them with a growing sense of nausea. Not a single apology, not one message asking if I was okay. Instead, there was my father. "You've always been jealous of your sister. Tonight proved what we always knew." And my stepmother, "Lydia, is devastated because of you. I hope you're proud of yourself." Cousins I barely knew chimed in. Lydia's friends, people I'd never met, had somehow got my number and felt entitled to tell me I was a terrible person for causing a scene at the wedding. I was about to throw the phone onto the passenger seat when I noticed one message from an unknown number, different from all the rest. "I saw what happened. You deserved better. A friend from the past." I stared at it, trying to place who could have sent it. The area code was local, but the number itself meant nothing. A friend from the past. The words felt like a lifeline thrown across dark water, and I didn't even know who was holding the other end. The light turned green. A car behind me honked. I kept driving, but instead of heading for the motorway, I found myself turning in the direction of Riverside Memorial Cemetery. The gates were locked, but I'd been there enough times in the last 3 years to know the spot in the fence where the base had rusted through, creating an opening just wide enough to slip through. I parked on the street, kicked off my heels, and walked barefoot through the damp grass, my cheap dress gathering dew and dirt at the hem. My mother's grave was in the old section under an oak tree that had been there longer than I'd been alive. The headstone was simple, just her name, the dates and the words, "Beloved Mother," which I'd insisted on over my father's suggestion that we keep it neutral. I sat down on the grass, not caring that it was wet, not caring about anything except the weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. For the first time since the ballroom, I let myself cry. And these weren't the quiet, dignified tears one sheds at funerals. These were ugly, gasping sobs that tore from my throat as if they'd been trapped there for years. "I tried, Mum," I said aloud to the stone, to the ground beneath it, to whatever was left of the one person who had ever truly seen me. "I tried so hard to be good enough. I gave up everything. I came home and took care of you when no one else would. I held your hand when you were scared. I was there every single day, and they still treat me like I'm worthless." Then came the anger, sharp and pure and clarifying. Not sadness, not grief. Pure rage for every year I'd been diminished, dismissed, and discarded by the people who were supposed to love me. I remembered my mother's last words, spoken in the hospice room, while she was still lucid enough to know what was coming. She'd squeezed my hand with surprising strength and pulled me close. "You're stronger than they know, my love," she'd whispered, her voice already failing. "Promise me you won't let them define you. Promise." I had promised, but I hadn't kept it, had I? I'd let them define me as the failure, the disappointment, the unemployed loser who gave up a career for nothing. I touched the cool marble of the headstone, tracing my mother's name with my fingertips. I'm not going to let them bury me the way they buried you, Mum. I said, my voice firmer now, hardening, as if steel were forming in my spine. Not anymore. I don't know how yet, but I swear I'm going to make them see. I'm going to make all of them see. The business card was still in my handbag. Call me on Monday, Mr. Gryson had said. Your mother saved my daughter's life once. I had thought tonight was my rock bottom. I didn't know it was actually my starting line. I woke up on Sunday morning to sunlight stabbing through the gap in my curtains, and a headache so fierce it felt like my skull was going to split open. The clock on my bedside table read 9:43 a.m., which meant I'd had maybe 3 hours of sleep. My eyes were swollen. My throat was raw from crying, and I was still in my wedding guest dress, crumpled and grass-stained because I'd collapsed into bed fully clothed sometime near dawn. That's when I saw the business card. I must have taken it out of my bag and placed it there before I fell asleep, though I had no memory of doing so. In the morning light, it looked almost ordinary. A cream-coloured card with embossed lettering that read, Marcus Gryson CEO, Gryson Industries. But when I turned the card over, I saw the handwritten note on the back in an immaculate script. Call me on Monday. We need to talk about Rose. Rose, my mother's name. I sat up slowly, holding the card between my fingers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How did Lydia's boss know my mother? More importantly, how did he know her well enough to refer to her by her first name as if they were friends? My mother had been a nurse working mostly in pediatric care and later volunteering at the hospice, where she eventually became a patient. She had never mentioned knowing anyone named Marcus Grayson. I grabbed my laptop from the floor where I'd left it days ago and typed his name into the search bar. The results filled my screen instantly. Marcus Grayson wasn't just a CEO. He was a decorated philanthropist who donated millions to children's hospitals. A business leader known for his ethical practices in an industry that often rewarded the opposite, and a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 8 years prior. There were photos of him cutting ribbons at hospital wings, shaking hands with politicians, and accepting awards for corporate responsibility. The dissonance made me dizzy. This was the man who had employed my sister, who had tolerated her presence in his company until the moment she revealed her true character in that ballroom. Why had he hired her in the first place? Why had he been silent about knowing my mother until that exact moment? I rehearsed what I would say when I called him, practicing different opening lines out loud to my empty flat. Mr. Gryson, this is Gillian Lowe. Thank you for what you did on Saturday night. No, that sounded too grateful, too meek. Mr. Gryson, I'm calling about your message regarding my mother. Better but formal to the point of being cold. I must have tried a dozen variations before giving up and placing the card back on my bedside table, telling myself I'd figure it out before Monday came. That afternoon, while I was still in jogging bottoms and an old university t-shirt trying to convince myself to eat something, there was a knock at my door. I considered ignoring it. I wasn't ready to face anyone, especially if news of the wedding disaster had already spread. But the knocking persisted, gentle but insistent, and I finally dragged myself to the door and peered through the peephole. Mrs. Grant stood in the hallway, my elderly neighbour from 2 doors down, who had known my mother from their book club days. She was holding a wooden box against her chest, and her expression was serious in a way that made me open the door immediately. Gillian, dear, she said, her voice having that tone people use when they're about to say something important. I have something your mother left for you. She made me promise I'd give it to you after. Well, after something like what happened at that wedding. My mouth went dry. You knew about the wedding. I know people who were there, dear. News travels. She held out the box, and I recognized it instantly. My mother's old recipe box, the wooden one with hand-painted roses on the lid that had sat on our kitchen counter my entire childhood. Rose gave this to me about a month before she passed. She said, "You'll know when she needs it." I took the box with trembling hands. It was heavier than I remembered, and when I opened it, I understood why. Yes, there were recipe cards in my mother's neat handwriting, her famous lasagna, her Christmas biscuits, her Sunday roast. But tucked between the cards were papers that didn't belong, printouts of emails, drafts of projects with dates clearly visible in the headers, copies of contracts with signatures. I recognized my own and Lydia's. Mrs. Grant squeezed my shoulder. "Your mother was a smart woman, Gillian. Smarter than any of them gave her credit for. She knew what was happening even when she was too sick to stop it." Then she was gone, closing the door quietly behind her, leaving me standing in my living room with a box full of proof I hadn't even known existed. I carried the box to the kitchen table and began pulling out the papers, my hands shaking. There was the marketing proposal I'd drafted 5 years ago for a sustainable fashion campaign, complete with my signature typo in the third paragraph where I'd written concession instead of connection. Tucked beneath it was a printout of an email from Lydia to a client dated 3 weeks after my draft, pitching the exact same concept with the same typo, claiming it as her original work. There was more campaign after campaign, idea after idea, all mine, all presented by Lydia, as if they had sprung fully formed from her own mind. My mother had documented everything, had likely been quietly collecting evidence for months or even years. At the bottom of the box, carefully taped to the wood, was a USB stick. A handwritten sticky note from my mother read, "For Gillian when the time is right." I grabbed my laptop again, my hands trembling so badly I could barely plug the stick in. When it loaded, there was a single folder titled "The Truth About 2019." Inside were email exchanges. I had never seen messages between Lydia and our father discussing how to leverage my ideas, how to ensure I stayed out of the spotlight while Lydia built her career. There were documents with a timeline showing exactly when I'd created each concept and when Lydia had presented it. The proof was meticulous, damning, and utterly devastating in what it revealed about the people I called family. But it was the audio file that broke me. I clicked on it, and my mother's voice filled my flat, younger and stronger than I remembered from her last months. She was arguing with my father, her words sharp, laced with an anger I'd rarely heard from her. "Lydia needs this opportunity, more than Gillian," my father was saying, his voice calm and rational in that infuriating way he had. "Gillian will land on her feet. She always does. You're stealing from your own daughter." My mother's voice cracked with emotion. "This is her work, her ideas, her future. You're just handing it to Lydia as if it's nothing." "I'm protecting this family's future," my father replied coldly. "Gillian is too independent. She'll be fine. Lydia needs the support, the guidance, the leg up. That's what good parents do." The file ended there, cutting off mid-argument, and I sat frozen in my chair as the silence rushed back in to envelop me. A small slip of paper had fallen out from between the recipe cards, and I picked it up with numb fingers, my mother's handwriting again shaky this time, likely from her final weeks. "Ask Pastor Ruth. She knows everything. Trust Grayson." Pastor Ruth from the church my mother had attended faithfully for 20 years. Marcus Grayson, who had fired my sister for her cruelty, had left me his card with my mother's name on it. My mother hadn't just left me recipes. She had left me a loaded gun, and I was about to learn how to aim it. On Monday morning, I sat in my car in the car park of a supermarket 3 blocks from my flat, staring at my phone as if it were about to explode. I was too anxious to make the call from home, afraid the familiar walls might somehow sap the courage I'd managed to scrape together. At 9 a.m. on the dot, I dialed the number on Marcus Greison's business card. A professional female voice answered on the second ring. Greison Industries, Mr. Greison's office. I cleared my throat, trying to sound more confident than I felt. This is Gillian Lowe calling for Mr. Greison. There was no pause, no request to hold. Ms. Lowe, he's been expecting your call. One moment, please. He's been expecting your call. As if he knew for a fact that I would call, that I wouldn't let fear or pride stop me from finding out what he knew about my mother. Before I could process that thought, a man's voice came on the line, warm and unmistakably the same voice that had fired my sister with such quiet authority. Gillian, thank you for calling. I know Saturday night was difficult, and I'm sorry if I made it worse, but what I did was necessary. I'm not calling to complain about what you did, Mr. Greison. I'm calling because you mentioned my mother. Yes, I did. And what I need to tell you can't be said over the phone. Can you come to my office this morning, say 10:30? What I have to share requires privacy and time. An hour later, I was standing in the lobby of a glass and steel building in the city centre, feeling completely out of place in the one professional outfit I still owned that fit properly. The receptionist waved me through to the executive floor, and I rode the lift up with my stomach in knots, acutely aware that I hadn't set foot in a corporate office in 3 years. The professional world felt alien to me now, like a language I'd once spoken fluently, but had forgotten from disuse. Greison's assistant, the woman I'd spoken to on the phone, greeted me with genuine warmth and led me down a corridor lined with tasteful art. I was bracing myself for one of those intimidating corner offices with floor-to-ceiling windows and cold, modern furniture designed to make visitors feel small. Instead, she opened the door to a space that felt almost cozy. Yes, it was large, and yes, the view of the city was breathtaking. But the office was filled with warm wooden furniture, comfortable-looking chairs, and an entire wall of family photographs. Children at various ages, a beautiful woman, who must have been his late wife, candid shots that depicted real life rather than staged perfection. Greison stood up from behind his desk, and in the daylight in his own environment, he looked both more powerful and more human than he had at the wedding. He gestured to a seating area by the window. 2 leather armchairs, separated by a small table. Thank you for coming, Gillian. I know this must feel strange. Please sit. I sat down, clutching my handbag in my lap like a shield. You said you needed to tell me about my mother. When he nodded, settling into the chair opposite me, and for a moment he seemed to be deciding where to begin. 15 years ago, my daughter Lily was 8 years old. My wife Catherine was on a business trip in London, and I was at home with Lily when a drunk driver ran a red light and T-boned our car. Lily took the worst of it. His voice remained steady, but I could hear the old fear behind it, the kind of fear that never fully goes away, even when the crisis is over. She was in critical condition. Internal bleeding, a fractured skull. The surgeons weren't sure she'd make it through the night. Catherine couldn't get a flight back for 18 hours. I was alone in that hospital watching my little girl fight for her life, and I was falling apart. He stood up, walked to his desk, picked up a framed photograph, and came back to hand it to me. Your mother was volunteering that night on the pediatric ward. She wasn't assigned to Lily's case. She wasn't even supposed to be in the ICU. But she saw me in the hallway and she stopped. I looked at the photograph. It showed a young girl, maybe 9 or 10, sitting up in a hospital bed with a shy smile. Beside the bed, holding the girl's hand, was my mother, younger and healthier than I remembered her from her final years, wearing her volunteer's smock and smiling with a tenderness that brought a lump to my throat. She didn't have to stay with me. Grayson continued, his voice thick with emotion. She had other duties, other patients, but she stayed with me all night. She prayed with me even though I'm not a religious man. She told me stories about her two daughters to distract me from the terror. She made me laugh when I thought I'd never laugh again. When Lily stabilized around dawn and the doctor said she was going to make it, I tried to thank your mother properly. I wanted to pay her to make a donation to the hospital in her name something. She refused it all. He paused, and I could see he was watching my face, perhaps looking for traces of my mother in my features. She said, "You just take care of your little girl. That's all the thanks I need." Then she squeezed my hand and went back to her rounds as if she hadn't just saved me right along with my daughter. I couldn't speak. I knew my mother was kind, knew she had touched many lives through her work, but hearing this story from a man who was clearly still filled with gratitude 15 years later made her feel more real than she had since she died. "I never forgot," Grayson said quietly. "I tried to find her afterwards to at least send a proper thank you, but she'd moved and the hospital couldn't give me her information. I kept looking over the years, but Rose Lowe is a common enough name that I always hit a dead end." "So how did you find her through Lydia?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I didn't find her. She found me in a way." He moved back to his chair. 5 years ago, a young woman named Lydia Hart interviewed for a position at my company. During the background check, I saw that her emergency contact was Rose Lowe, relationship mother. I couldn't believe it could be the same woman, but I had to know. When I interviewed Lydia in person, I asked about her family. She talked about her mother, the nurse, and I knew it was her. I asked about siblings, and that's when Lydia told me about you. My heart was pounding. "What did she say?" Grayson's expression darkened. "She said you had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. She even cried telling me the story, said it had been very hard on your mother, that they were still grieving. I was devastated. I had wanted to repay Rose's kindness by helping her daughter. And I thought I'd lost my chance with you. So I hired Lydia, thinking that at least I could support the child Rose had left. The betrayal hit me full force, though I shouldn't have been surprised. Of course, Lydia had told him I was dead. It was the perfect way to ensure my name never came up in conversation, that I never threatened her narrative. Then I saw you at the wedding," Grayson continued, "very much alive. And in that moment when Lydia introduced you with such cruelty, when your father joined in, I understood that I'd been played for a fool. I had been championing someone who not only stole from her own sister, but had erased her from existence just to maintain a comfortable lie." He opened a drawer in the table between us and took out a manila envelope, sliding it across to me. "Your mother contacted me 6 months before she passed away. She'd seen an article about my company and recognized my name. We met several times. She told me everything, Gillian, about what your father had done about Lydia's theft, about her own regret that she hadn't been strong enough to stop it. She set up a trust fund in your name and asked me to be one of the trustees, along with your pastor Ruth. This document names you as a trustee, subject to Pastor Ruth's confirmation that you have chosen the right path forward." I opened the envelope with trembling hands, staring at legal documents I barely understood, but recognizing my mother's signature at the bottom of several pages. My mother had been playing chess while they were playing drafts, and she was moving pieces from beyond the grave. I left Grayson's office with the trust fund documents in my bag and my mother's USB stick, taking up space in my pocket. I had physical evidence in the recipe box, I had audio recordings, but what I needed was something irrefutable, something that couldn't be dismissed as a family squabble or conflicting memories. I needed digital proof that would stand up to scrutiny, and I knew exactly who could help me find it. Sarah Shane and I had worked together for 6 years at the marketing firm. where I'd built my career before it all fell apart. She was in IT security, the person we called when clients worried about data breaches or when we needed to recover files from corrupted hard drives. We'd bonded over terrible office coffee and a shared frustration with corporate politics. When I'd left to care for my mother, Sarah was one of the few people who had stayed in touch, sending occasional messages to check in, even when I was too exhausted to reply properly. I called her from my car, and she answered on the third ring with her trademark bluntness. "Gillian Lowe, it's been a while. Please tell me you're calling because you want to have lunch and catch up, not because you're in some kind of trouble." I wish it were that simple. "Sarah, I need your help with something. Forensic help, you know." There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into a professional gear. "When can you meet me?" We ended up at a diner halfway between our places. One of those old-fashioned spots with red vinyl booths and waitresses who called everyone Love. Sarah was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her laptop bag beside her. She'd cut her hair shorter since I'd last seen her, and there were a few silver strands mixed in with the black now, but her sharp, analytical eyes were just as I remembered. I slid into the booth opposite her, took out the USB stick, and placed it on the table between us as if it were made of nitroglycerin. Then I told her everything. The wedding Greyson's revelation, my mother's hidden evidence, the audio recording of my father's betrayal. Sarah listened without interrupting her expression, growing darker as the story unfolded. When I was finished, she picked up the USB stick and turned it over in her hands. "You understand what you're asking me to do. Once I go through this, once we establish a timeline and recover the metadata, there's no going back. You'll have proof that could destroy your sister's career and potentially land your father in legal trouble." "I know," I said, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I need to know the truth, Sarah. The whole truth, not just what my mother managed to document. I need to know exactly what they did and when they did it." She nodded slowly. "This could take 3 to 5 days, maybe more, depending on what I find. Recovering metadata from 5 years ago and establishing a precise timeline requires a deep dive cross-referencing multiple sources. But if what you're saying is true, we'll find the fingerprints. People always leave tracks, especially when they think they're being clever." She put the USB stick in her laptop bag. "I'll call you when I have something." Those 3 days were among the longest of my life. I tried to keep busy, tried to focus on mundane tasks like grocery shopping and cleaning my flat. But my mind kept circling back to what Sarah might be uncovering. I jumped every time my phone rang and could barely sleep, spending the nights lying awake, playing out different scenarios of what the evidence might reveal. When Sarah finally called on Thursday afternoon, I was in the middle of folding laundry and nearly dropped my phone trying to answer it. "Come to my place," she said without preamble. "You need to see this in person." Sarah lived in a converted loft in the city centre, and her home office was exactly what I'd expected: 3 large monitors, equipment I couldn't identify, and the low hum of computer fans creating a constant white noise. She gestured for me to sit in the chair beside her, and I could see the barely contained excitement under her professional demeanour. "Watch this," she said, pulling up a split screen on her centre monitor. On the left was what looked like an email interface. On the right was a presentation document. "This email draft is from your personal Gmail account, dated 15th March 2019. It contains the full outline for something called the Authentic Connection Strategy campaign. It was never sent, Gillian. It just sat in your drafts folder." I leaned closer, recognizing my own words, my own organizational structure. "I remember writing that. I was developing the idea for a pitch that never happened because I had to leave work to care for my mother." Now look at this, Sarah said, pointing to the document on the right. This is Lydia's presentation to Mitel and Associates dated 3rd April 2019. That's 19 days after your draft. She used her mouse to highlight sections of text. It's not just similar, Gillian. It's identical. Same structure, same talking points, same strategy. And here's the kicker. Look at paragraph 3, second sentence. I read where she was pointing and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The word concession jumped out at me, the same typo I always made when I was typing too fast, my fingers hitting the keys in the wrong order. She even copied your typos, Sarah said quietly, but it gets better. Or worse, depending on your point of view. She right-clicked on the document and brought up the Properties panel. When Lydia sent the presentation file, she made a crucial mistake. She got lazy or sloppy, probably both. The document properties still list Gillian Lowe as the original creator with a creation date in March. She must have opened your file, modified it slightly, and used Save As with her own name, but she didn't scrub the metadata. It's like signing someone else's name on a painting and forgetting to paint over their signature in the corner. I stared at the screen, at the irrefutable proof that my work had been stolen and presented as Lydia's original creation. That's enough, isn't it? That proves she stole my work. It absolutely proves it, Sarah confirmed. But there's one more thing, and this is where it gets really interesting. She pulled up another window. This one filled with technical data I couldn't fully understand. I tracked the access history on these files. Someone accessed your original draft from an external IP address 3 months ago. I ran the IP address against a business registry database. She paused, her eyes meeting mine. It came back to your father's law firm in the city centre. The words hit me like cold water. My father knew. Your father knew, Sarah confirmed. Someone at his law firm accessed your file, which means either he was checking the evidence himself or he had his lawyer do it. He knew what Lydia had done, and he chose to do nothing about it. He chose her anyway. I sank back into the chair, the weight of that betrayal settling over me like something physical. It was one thing to suspect, to feel that my father had always favoured Lydia. It was something else entirely to have proof that he had known about the theft, had investigated it himself, and had still chosen to support her while treating me like I was worthless. The evidence was irrefutable. The betrayal was complete, and my family had just declared war without knowing I had discovered their battle plans. The note my mother had left in the recipe box said to ask Pastor Ruth, and after seeing Sarah's evidence, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. The small community church where my mother had spent so many Sunday mornings was on a quiet, oak-lined street. Its white clapboard and simple steeple looking just as I remembered from the few times I'd accompanied her to services. I hadn't been back since her funeral. I couldn't bring myself to walk through those doors where we had said our final goodbyes. But now I had no choice. I found Pastor Ruth in her office, a modest room overflowing with books and the kind of comfortable clutter that spoke of a life spent serving others. She looked up as I knocked on the open door, and I saw immediate recognition in her face. She was in her late 60s, with grey hair pinned in a neat bun, and eyes that managed to be both gentle and piercingly direct. "Gillian," she said, standing and coming around the desk to embrace me. "I've been waiting for you. Your mother called me 2 weeks before she passed away. She said, 'Ruth, if my daughter ever comes to you looking lost, you tell her the whole truth. She's strong enough to handle it.'" We sat together in the chapel, the main sanctuary, empty and quiet in the late afternoon light. The stained glass windows cast coloured shadows across the wooden pews, and somewhere in the building I could hear the faint sound of a piano being played, likely the choir director practicing for Sunday service. Ruth sat in the pew beside me, her hands folded in her lap, and I could see she was steeling herself to speak about things she had clearly been holding on to for a long time. What I'm about to tell you now, your mother made me promise to keep secret. Until you asked, Ruth began, her voice steady, but laced with an old sorrow. It was one of the hardest promises I've ever had to keep. To see you at the funeral, to watch you struggle these last 3 years, knowing what I knew and not being able to say a word. What did you know? I asked, though a part of me dreaded the answer. Ruth took a deep breath. I witnessed your father coerce your mother into signing away your inheritance. It was 5 years ago, not long after your grandmother passed. I was visiting Rose. She'd just received her cancer diagnosis and was scared and vulnerable. Your father showed up with the papers, and I'll never forget the look on his face. Cold determination, like he was closing a business deal rather than talking to his dying ex-wife. She paused, and I could see her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Your grandmother's will left £300,000 to be divided equally between you and Lydia. Clean, simple fare. But your father had other plans. He told Rose that you were irresponsible with money, that you would squander your share, that for your own good, the inheritance should be redistributed entirely in Lydia's name. Rose refused at first, told him absolutely not. That's when he threatened her. Threatened her how? My voice came out as a whisper. He said that if she didn't sign, he would spread it around, that she'd embezzled money from her old employer, the hospital where she'd worked before she started volunteering. It was a complete fabrication, a vicious lie. But Rose had just been diagnosed with cancer. She was terrified of it going to court, that if there was an investigation and publicity, the stress would kill her before the disease did. She was also afraid it would tear apart what was left of the family, that you and Lydia would be caught in the middle of a legal battle. So she signed, believing she was protecting you from something worse. I felt tears streaming down my face, but I made no move to wipe them away. She protected me by giving away what was rightfully mine. She died believing she had failed you, Ruth said softly, her own eyes shining. The guilt ate away at her in those last months. She would tell me, I was too weak, Ruth. I should have fought for Gillian, but I was just so tired, so scared. But your mother was stronger than she knew, Gillian. She may have signed that document, but she found another way to fight. Ruth reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass key. Before your grandmother passed, before any of this happened, she set up a separate trust fund. She was a shrewd woman, and she knew your father's character better than anyone. The fund has a very specific condition. The money can only go to the grandchild who demonstrates moral character and chooses justice over revenge. Rose couldn't access it. She couldn't even tell you about it because the terms were ironclad, designed to stop your father from being able to manipulate the situation. I am the trustee your grandmother appointed precisely because she knew I would honor that intent. She pressed the key into my palm. This opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank in the city centre box, number 217. Your mother left something there for you. Her last words in her own voice. She recorded it 2 weeks before she died, when she still had the strength. She said to tell you, when Gillian is ready to face the whole truth, she'll know what to do with it. Ruth placed her weathered hand over mine, and I could feel its warmth, its steadiness. Rose's last words to me. Gillian spoken the day before she lost consciousness for good, were these: tell my daughter to seek justice, not revenge. There's a difference, and she'll know it when she sees it. She believed in you, in your integrity, in your strength. She knew you would eventually uncover what had been done, and she trusted you to handle it with wisdom instead of bitterness. I sat there in that silent chapel, holding the key to answers I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. feeling the weight of my mother's faith in me pressing down, like both a blessing and a challenge. I wasn't ready for the truth, but my mother had prepared a message that would change everything I thought I knew about love and sacrifice. Pastor Ruth insisted on accompanying me to First National Bank the next morning, and I was grateful for her steady presence as we walked across the marble-floored lobby to the safe deposit box area. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the small brass key twice before we reached the vault attendant. He was a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, and he handled our request with an efficient courtesy, leading us into the secure room where rows of metal boxes lined the walls like secrets waiting to be unlocked. Box 217 was in the middle section, and as the attendant retrieved it and carried it to the private viewing room, I was struck by how ordinary it looked. Just a plain grey metal box, identical to hundreds of others in that vault. But inside were the last words of the woman who had given me life and who had spent her final months trying to give me justice. The viewing room was little bigger than a cupboard with a small desk, 2 chairs, and a computer terminal for clients who needed to access digital materials. The attendant placed the box on the desk and left us alone, closing the door with a soft click that seemed to echo in the small space. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the box, before Pastor Ruth gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "Take your time, dear." When I finally lifted the lid, I was met with 4 items laid out with obvious care. On top was a letter 5 pages long in my mother's neat script on cream-coloured paper. Beneath it was a small passbook, the old-fashioned kind banks no longer issue. Beside it was a USB stick with a label in my mother's handwriting, "For my brave girl." And nestled in a corner wrapped in tissue paper was my mother's silver cross necklace, the one she'd worn every day of my childhood, and had never taken off, not even during her final illness. I picked up the letter first, my vision already blurring with tears, as I recognized the slight tremor in her handwriting that had emerged in her last months, when the painkillers made her hands unsteady. The first sentence nearly broke me. "My dearest Gillian, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally learned the truth. I was too weak to tell you while I was alive." The letter detailed everything Pastor Ruth had told me and more. My mother apologized repeatedly for not being stronger, for signing away my inheritance, for staying silent when she should have spoken out. But she also explained her reasoning with heartbreaking clarity. She had been terrified that fighting back would destroy what little family structure was left, that I would be embroiled in a legal battle that would consume years of my life, that the stress of public accusations and court proceedings would damage me more than the loss of money ever could. "I made the wrong choice," she wrote on the 3rd page, her handwriting growing more agitated. "I chose peace over justice, and in doing so, I taught you that being silent in the face of cruelty was somehow noble. Forgive me, my love. I should have been the mother who slayed dragons for you, but I was so tired, and the dragon was your own father." The final pages shifted in tone, becoming more fierce, more determined. She wrote about the savings account money she had carefully put aside from years of part-time nursing work and volunteer stipends, that my father had never known about £50,000, that was entirely mine, untouched by his manipulation. She wrote about contacting Marcus Grayson, about putting plans in motion that would only be activated after her death, about trusting that I would be strong enough to do what she could not. "You held on to yourself when everyone else sold themselves out," she wrote in the final paragraph. "You are my pride, my heart, my proof that goodness can survive even in soil poisoned by selfishness." I put down the letter and picked up the USB stick with trembling hands. Pastor Ruth gestured to the computer terminal. "The bank set that up specifically for situations like this. Go ahead, dear." The video player loaded slowly, and then my mother's face filled the screen. She was sitting up in what I recognized as her room at the hospice, propped against pillows, wearing the blue cardigan I'd given her for her birthday, 2 months before she died. She looked fragile, her face gaunt from the illness, but her eyes were clear and fixed on the camera with an intensity I recognized from childhood. The look she gave me when she needed me to really listen. "Hello, my brave girl," she began. And hearing her voice again after 3 years of silence cracked something open inside me. "If you're watching this, you know the truth now. You know what your father did, what Lydia did, and what I failed to do to stop them. I need to tell you everything, my love, because you deserve to understand why I made the choices I did, even the terrible ones." For the next 10 minutes, she spoke directly to the camera to me with an honesty that was almost painful to witness. She detailed how my father had systematically favored Lydia since childhood, how he'd pressured Rose to allow the theft of my work, by making her believe she was protecting family unity, how he'd threatened to destroy her reputation if she dared to stand up for me. "I was weak, my love," she said, tears streaming down her face on the screen. "I chose peace over justice. I chose silence over defending you. I told myself I was protecting the family. But really I was just protecting myself from conflict, from confrontation, from having to stand up to a man who had already proven he cared more about appearances than truth. And that was my sin, Gillian. That was my failure as your mother." But then her expression shifted, growing stronger, more resolute. "I am giving you now what I couldn't give you then, the truth and the resources to use it. This £50,000 is yours. Your father never knew it existed. Take it and start over. Build something he can't touch. Create a life that is entirely your own. There is a man named Grayson who will help you if I ask him to, and I have asked. But my darling, listen to me very carefully now." She leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but laced with a fierce urgency. "Do not use this information to destroy them. Use it to set yourself free. Justice is not about making them suffer the way they made you suffer. Justice is about ensuring the truth is told and that people face the consequences of their choices. Revenge poisons the one who wields it. Justice heals the one who seeks it. Choose wisely, my brave girl. I'll be watching from a better place, so proud of the woman you've become." The video ended there, freezing on her face, and I stared at the screen until it went black. Then I played it again, and again a third time, memorizing every inflection in her voice, every expression on her beloved face, the way her hands moved as she spoke, all the details I'd been terrified of forgetting. When I finally pulled out the USB stick and turned around, I saw that Pastor Ruth was crying, two silent tears making their way down her wrinkled cheeks. "She recorded that 2 weeks before she died," Ruth said softly. "She was in a great deal of pain that day, but refused her medication until she was finished. She was that determined. She told me, 'Gillian is the one worth fighting for, Ruth. She's the one who will understand the difference between justice and revenge.'" I fastened my mother's cross necklace around my neck, feeling the cool silver settle against my skin, like a blessing and a charge. My mother had given me a weapon, but she had also given me a conscience, and I would have to choose which one would guide me forward. A week after I left the bank with my mother's final message still hammering in my heart, my father called. I saw his name on my phone screen and thought about letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. When I answered, his voice was different from the cold dismissal I'd heard at the wedding. It was softer, almost gentle, the tone he always used when he wanted something from me. "Gillian, I think we need to talk about what happened. Family dinner this Saturday. Just us, no drama, No audience. We need to sort this out like adults. I recognized the manipulation instantly, the careful modulation designed to sound reasonable and conciliatory. The old Gillian would have been desperate for this olive branch, would have been eager to smooth things over and win back their approval. But I wasn't that woman anymore. My mother's voice was still fresh in my mind, and I had Sarah's forensic evidence. Pastor Ruth's testimony and a clear-eyed understanding of exactly who these people were. "What time?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. 7 o'clock. I'll have your stepmother make that roast you used to like. I agreed. And when Saturday evening came, I dressed carefully in simple black trousers and a cream sweater. Nothing fancy. Nothing that suggested I was trying too hard. I drove to the house I'd spent my teenage years in, parking on the street, instead of the driveway, keeping my escape route clear. When I rang the bell, my father answered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The dining table was set with my mother's china, the delicate rose pattern she had collected piece by piece over 20 years of marriage. Seeing those plates in this house being used by my stepmother as if they had always belonged here felt like a desecration. Lydia was already seated, and I could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were puffy and red-rimmed, her usually immaculate appearance replaced by something harder and more fragile. Her new husband was conspicuously absent. We sat down to dinner, and there was a moment of awkward silence before my father cleared his throat and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. "Gillian, perhaps we were a little harsh at the wedding. Tempers were high and things were said that maybe shouldn't have been said in that way. In that way. Not an apology, just an acknowledgement that the timing was poor." Lydia took her cue, the words coming out stiff and forced. "I shouldn't have introduced you like that. It was inappropriate." I said nothing, just took a sip of water and waited. I could see the frustration building on my father's face at my silence, at my refusal to immediately accept these hollow words and declare everything forgiven. He leaned forward, dropping the gentle approach. "If you drop whatever this is you're doing, and yes, we know you've been asking questions, talking to people, I'll give you £50,000. You used to talk about opening a little bakery. You could do that, have a quiet life. Lydia can rebuild her career. We can all move on and put this unpleasantness behind us." There it was, the real reason for this dinner. They knew I had something. They knew I'd been digging into the past, and they were trying to buy my silence before I could use whatever I'd found, for me to disappear quietly so they could get on with their comfortable lies. I looked at each of them in turn, taking my time, letting them squirm in the silence. Then I smiled a small, calm smile that I could see unsettled them more than anger would have. "That's an interesting proposal. Let me think about it." We ate the rest of the meal in a tense quiet, broken only by my occasional comments on trivial things. But then I started telling stories about my mother, seemingly random memories of her kindness. How she'd spent her Saturdays volunteering at the children's hospital. How she'd saved up money to help a neighbor pay for car repairs. How she'd always said that character wasn't measured by what you earned, but by what you did when no one was watching. I watched my father's face grow more and more uncomfortable with each story. I saw him shift in his chair, his jaw tight. Good. Let him remember the woman whose reputation he had threatened, whose final wishes he had ignored. When the meal finally ended, I stood to leave, thanking my stepmother for the meal with perfect politeness. As I slung my handbag over my shoulder, I made a show of checking for my keys, and in that instant I let the USB stick I had purposely placed in the outer pocket slip and fall. It clattered onto the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed abnormally loud in the quiet house. Lydia bent down, picked it up and turned it over in her hands. "Is this yours?" I took it from her, examining it, as if trying to remember what was on it. then looked directly into her eyes. Actually, it's a copy of something Mum left for me. You keep it, Lydia. Maybe you'll learn something about the difference between talent and plagiarism. I placed the USB stick deliberately on the dining table right next to my mother's desecrated china and walked out. I didn't look back, didn't wait for their reactions. Just walked out the front door and to my car in measured steps. Once I was inside and the doors were locked, I allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. That USB stick contained everything Sarah had found. The email metadata, the timeline of intellectual property theft, the document properties that showed my name as the original creator. And it also contained the audio file of my father threatening my mother, his voice cold and calculating as he coerced her into signing away my inheritance. By morning, they would know exactly how much evidence existed. They would spend the night opening that drive, watching their carefully constructed lies unravel piece by piece. The fear would consume them. The uncertainty of what I planned to do with this information would rob them of sleep. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. That drive you wanted me to duplicate perfect copy. They're going to spend all night staring at their own ruin. I started the car and drove away from that house. My mother's cross necklace was warm against my skin. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. Not the empty power that comes from cruelty or revenge, but the solid strength that comes from standing in the truth and refusing to be moved. I didn't need to raise my voice. I had let the truth scream for me, and by morning they would hear it echoing in their nightmares. I'd been home for less than 2 hours, lying in bed, replaying the dinner in my mind, when my phone shattered the silence at 2:07 a.m. The screen showed Lydia's name, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something made me answer, maybe curiosity about how quickly they'd opened that drive, maybe a morbid desire to hear what excuse she would concoct this time. Instead, there were sobs, raw and desperate, in a way I'd never heard from my polished, controlled younger sister. "I watched it," she said through her tears. "I watched everything on the drive. Chi, I'm sorry." The word hit me like a physical shock. Chi, the Vietnamese word for older sister, something our mother taught us when we were little, a heritage she wanted us to carry. Lydia hadn't called me that since we were children before our father's divorce, and remarriage had fractured everything into a before and an after. "Lydia, it's 2 in the morning," I said. But I didn't hang up. Something in her voice kept me on the line, something that sounded like genuine anguish, not the performed emotion I was used to. I know. I couldn't sleep. I've been sitting here for hours watching these files, reading the metadata, listening to the audio of Dad and Mum fighting. Chi, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know half of what Dad did. The inheritance, the threats against Mum. I didn't know. But you knew about my work. I said, my voice harder than I intended. You knew those ideas were mine. There was a long pause filled only by her ragged breathing. Yes, I knew. Dad told me you were selfish for leaving your job to look after Mum. He said you'd abandoned your career and it was a waste to let your ideas go unused, that someone should take advantage of them. He helped me do it. He went through your old files, helped me package them, polish them, showed me how to present them as my own. I knew it was wrong, but I was so scared. Scared of what? I asked, sitting up in bed, fully awake now. Scared of having to do your own work. Scared of not being the favorite anymore. Scared of failing. Her voice broke on the word. Scared of not being good enough. Of Dad looking at me the way he looked at you, after you left your job, like you were a disappointment, a waste of potential. I thought if I could just be successful, if I could just be impressive enough, Maybe he'd actually love me instead of just using me as a weapon against you. The confession hung in the air between us, and I heard something in it I'd never considered before, that Lydia had been just as manipulated by our father as I had, just in a different way. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it complicated the simple narrative I'd been holding on to. "There's something else," Lydia said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm 6 weeks pregnant. We only found out 3 days ago. Marcus and I were going to announce it at the after-party. But then everything fell apart when Mr. Gryson fired me in front of everyone. Those words stopped me cold. 6 weeks pregnant. I did the maths quickly. She must have found out just before the wedding. Must have been holding on to that joyful secret, even as she introduced me to her boss as an unemployed failure. I'm losing everything. Cheat," she went on, the sobs returning harder and more desperate now. "The job is gone. Marcus can barely look at me after finding out what I did. He keeps saying he doesn't know who he married. My father is panicking about the exposure, calling me every hour, demanding to know what you're planning. And now I'm bringing a baby into this entire mess. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix any of this." I sat in my dark room phone pressed to my ear, feeling the weight of this new information settle over me like a heavy blanket. A baby. An innocent life that had nothing to do with the sins of its parents, but would be affected by the fallout all the same. The image of Lydia, pregnant and terrified and alone, didn't erase what she'd done to me, but it made the path forward suddenly far less clear. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Justice, not revenge. "What do you want from me?" Lydia asked, her voice weak and watery. "Money, I'll pay it all back somehow. A public apology, I'll do it. I'll stand up in front of everyone and admit what I did. Please, Chai, don't destroy what's left of my life. I know I don't deserve mercy. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but this baby does. This baby hasn't done anything wrong." I closed my eyes, feeling the pull of two conflicting truths. Yes, she was pregnant. Yes, she was scared. But she was only sorry now because she'd been caught, only asking for help, because the consequences were closing in. Where was this honesty 5 years ago when she first took my work? Where was it 3 years ago when I came home to care for our sick mother while she built a career on my stolen ideas? "I don't want your money, Lydia," I said finally, my voice steady and clear. "I want you to face what you did. I want Dad to face what he did. I want the truth to matter more than keeping up appearances, and I want you to raise this baby knowing that honesty and integrity matter. That character isn't something you perform for others, but something you build in private when no one is watching. Those are things you and Dad never taught me, things I had to learn from Mum, despite you both trying to hide it from me." "Can you ever forgive me?" she whispered, and I could hear the genuine fear in the question, as if my answer mattered more than she wanted to admit. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Ask me again when you've actually faced the consequences, instead of just crying because you got caught. Ask me again when you've done the work to become someone worthy of forgiveness, instead of just someone who wants to avoid punishment." I hung up before she could reply, before the sound of her weeping could shake my resolve. I sat in the darkness of my room, my mother's cross necklace cool against my skin, and thought about justice versus mercy, about accountability versus compassion, about the baby who would be born into the wreckage of choices made before it even existed. She wanted mercy before justice, forgiveness before accountability. But I had learned the hard way that healing only happens in the right order. 2 weeks after Lydia's middle-of-the-night phone call, Marcus Grayson reached out with an unexpected opportunity. Mittel and Associates. The firm where Lydia had built her reputation had launched an internal investigation after an anonymous tip about irregularities in her portfolio. Someone had sent the compliance department a detailed message suggesting that key campaigns attributed to Lydia Hart might not have been her original work, and the firm's legal team was now scrambling to determine if they had unknowingly showcased stolen intellectual property. Grayson explained that as an advisor to a partner firm's board, he had recommended me as a freelance marketing consultant to assess the authenticity of the campaigns in question. My identity would be disclosed to the legal team for ethical compliance, but I would be working behind the scenes, analyzing documents, rather than sitting in on meetings or confrontations. It was professional, it was proper, and it gave me access to everything I needed to build an airtight case. I accepted immediately. The conference room they gave me at Mittel and Associates was small and windowless, but it served its purpose. For 3 days, I was surrounded by 5 years of Lydia's work campaign briefs, client presentations, strategy documents, and performance reports. Sarah came by each evening after the office had emptied out, helping me organize the material and cross-reference it with the timeline we had already established from my mother's USB drive. What we uncovered was staggering in its scope. The authentic connection strategy hadn't been a one-off theft. It was a pattern that repeated itself across dozens of campaigns. I'd recognized concepts I had sketched out in notebooks years ago. Strategies I had outlined in emails that were never sent, frameworks I had developed during late-night sessions when I still believed my career had a future. All of it had been filtered through Lydia's presentations, with just enough cosmetic changes to make it look different to an untrained eye. But I had a trained eye. I knew my own work the way a mother knows her child's face, and I could spot the telltale signs of someone who had co-opted talent without understanding its foundations. Lydia's implementations were consistently shallow, lacking the theoretical underpinnings that made the strategies work. Her reports showed an inconsistency in strategic thinking, jumping from one approach to another, without the connective logic that would have been obvious if she'd actually developed these concepts herself. It was like watching someone perform a piano concerto they had memorized by rote, without understanding any music theory technically correct on the surface, but hollow at its core. I documented everything with clinical precision, creating spreadsheets that mapped the timeline of my original work against Lydia's presentations, highlighting the gaps in her understanding and noting the places where her explanation contradicted the core principles she claimed to be implementing. By the end of the 3rd day, I had 47 pages of analysis that left no room for doubt or interpretation. On the 4th day, the legal team brought Lydia in to present her case. I was told I could observe from an adjacent room fitted with one-way glass, a standard feature in corporate investigation facilities. I sat in the dark observation room with 2 lawyers, watching Lydia walk into the conference room on the other side of the glass. She looked thinner than she had at the wedding, her face strained with stress, but it was clear she had tried to project an air of confidence. A smart navy blue suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, minimal jewelry. The lead solicitor, a woman named Patricia Shen, who had been nothing but professional with me throughout the process, began with easy questions designed to put Lydia at ease. How long had she been with the firm? What drew her to marketing? Could she walk them through her general approach to campaign development? Lydia answered smoothly, her voice steady, and I could see her relax slightly as the questions remained broad. Then Patricia moved on to the authentic connection strategy, asking Lydia to explain the rationale behind the campaign's framework. I watched my sister launch into a polished, rehearsed explanation, gesturing to the slides she had displayed on the conference room screen. She talked about consumer authenticity, brand trust, and market differentiation, using all the buzzwords without actually saying anything of substance. But she looked confident, and I realized she thought this was going well. Then Patricia interrupted her mid-sentence. Could you explain why you chose to emphasize concession in your materials? Lydia didn't hesitate. Well, the connection between the brand and the consumer is central to the entire strategy. We wanted to stress how authentic interactions build lasting relationships that… I'm sorry, Patricia said, her voice polite but firm. I said concession, spelled Concession. The word appears 3 times in your presentation materials in the exact same positions and contexts as it appeared in a draft email written by a Ms. Gillian Lowe in March of 2019. The room went dead silent. I watched the colour drain from Lydia's face. I watched her mouth open and close without a sound. I watched her hands grip the edge of the conference table, as if it were the only solid thing left in her crumbling world. Patricia slid a document across the table, and even from my position behind the glass, I could see it was Sarah's metadata analysis, complete with the side-by-side comparisons and timestamps that made the theft irrefutable. Mrs. Hart, Patricia continued, her voice now devoid of any warmth. We have conducted a thorough forensic analysis of your campaign materials. The evidence suggests a systematic appropriation of intellectual property belonging to your sister. Do you have any explanation for why your work consistently mirrors concepts she documented years prior to your presentations? Lydia looked from the document to Patricia, then towards the one-way glass, as if she could somehow sense I was watching from the other side. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. After what felt like an eternity, she whispered, I need to speak to my solicitor. I sat in that dark observation room, watching my sister's professional reputation crumble in real time, and I felt a strange cocktail of emotions I couldn't name. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something closer to the sad vindication that comes from being right about something you desperately wished you were wrong about. She had built her career on my words, and now she was drowning in them, one typo at a time. 3 weeks after I watched Lydia's presentation fall apart in that conference room, I received a phone call from Patricia Shen, the lead solicitor who was overseeing the investigation. Her tone was apologetic, in a way that immediately put me on high alert. Ms. Lowe, could you come in tomorrow morning? We need to discuss the findings and the next steps. When I arrived the next day, Patricia sat opposite me in the same conference room, where I had spent days analyzing my sister's stolen work and delivered news that felt like a punch to the gut. While we have found troubling similarities between your materials and Mrs. Hart's presentations, she began, her words carefully chosen and clearly rehearsed, we cannot definitively prove intellectual property theft without a formal complaint being lodged by you. The materials in question were created while you were at another company, and the chain of custody is not clear. There are also questions about whether ideas can be copyrighted versus the specific expression of those ideas. Our legal department has decided to suspend the investigation until an external complaint is filed by you through the proper legal channels. I stared at her, letting the words sink in. You found 47 documented instances of theft over 5 years. You have metadata showing she used my original files. You caught her lying about a typo she couldn't possibly have made on her own. And you're telling me that's not enough? Patricia had the decency to look uncomfortable. It's not that there isn't enough proof of what happened. It's that the firm doesn't want the liability or the negative publicity of formally admitting we've been promoting work that may have been stolen. If we fire Mrs. Hart, based on internal findings, we open ourselves up to a wrongful dismissal lawsuit. If we admit to showcasing stolen IP, we open ourselves up to claims from clients who paid for that work. The board has decided the safest course of action is to place Mrs. Hart on voluntary paid leave while the issues are resolved externally. Voluntary paid leave, I repeated slowly. So she gets a paid holiday while this blows over, and you get to pretend you've taken action without actually taking any responsibility. I'm sorry, Ms. Lowe. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. I believe everything you documented, but corporate law is complex, and sometimes what is right and what is legal don't align as neatly as we'd like. I left that meeting feeling like I'd been slapped, like all the work, all the documentation, all the careful analysis had been for nothing. Mittel and Associates had chosen the path of least resistance, protecting their own interests, while my sister walked away, virtually unscathed. 2 days later, a friend from university sent me a screenshot with the message, "Have you seen this?" It was a social media post from Lydia, and as I read it, my blood pressure shot up in a way I hadn't felt since the wedding. I have been falsely accused by a family member struggling with jealousy and mental health issues. Lydia wrote the words carefully crafted to paint herself as the victim and me as unstable. After a thorough investigation, my company has found no wrongdoing. I am taking some time off to focus on my growing family and will be back stronger. Thank you to everyone for your support during this difficult time. She'd added hashtags, hashtag falsely accused, hashtag family betrayal, hashtag truth wins. The post had been up for less than 12 hours and already had hundreds of supportive comments, all buying into her carefully constructed narrative. Friends of hers I'd never met were sharing it with their own commentary about how toxic family jealousy was how pregnancy made women vulnerable to attack, and how some people just couldn't handle the success of others. Several people tagged me directly in the comments. "Stop harassing your pregnant sister," one woman wrote. "Get help before you hurt someone," another added. My name was being dragged through the mud on social media by strangers who knew nothing of the truth, who had swallowed Lydia's version of events without question, simply because it came wrapped in the sympathetic package of a pregnant woman being attacked by her bitter sister. My phone buzzed with messages from friends and former colleagues, some sending support, others asking if I was okay. A few tentatively inquiring if there was any truth to Lydia's claims about my mental health. The implication was clear. Even people who knew me were starting to wonder if maybe I had gone too far, if maybe my grief over my mother's death had curdled into something unhealthy. I sat with the phone in my hand, watching the comments multiply, feeling that old familiar urge to defend myself, to explain, to make everyone understand the truth. But then I remembered something my mother had said in that video about how dignity sometimes means knowing when not to engage, when silence is more powerful than argument. I opened Lydia's post and left a single comment. "I'm glad you're at peace now. Enjoy it while it lasts. The truth has a way of coming out when we least expect it." Then I turned off my notifications and put my phone aside. I didn't argue with the strangers in her comments. I didn't try to defend myself or correct the narrative. I just left my words there, cryptic and calm, while everyone else whipped themselves into a frenzy around them. That night, Marcus Grayson sent me a private message. "I know this feels like a defeat, but corporations are cowards when it comes to anything that might expose them to legal liability. We need a different arena, public accountability through legitimate journalism. I have a contact. A woman who specializes in investigative reporting on corporate ethics and workplace misconduct. She's trusted and she's thorough. If you're willing, I can make an introduction." I sat in my flat, my mother's cross necklace warm against my skin, and thought about everything that had led me to this moment. The humiliation of the wedding, the USB drive full of proof, my mother's video message imploring me to choose justice over revenge. Mittel and associates had chosen corporate self-interest over truth. Lydia had chosen to double down on her lies rather than take responsibility, but I still had a choice about how to respond. I picked up my phone and replied to Gryson's message. Let's set up the meeting, but we're going to do this right. Facts only. Documented proof, no personal attacks. If we're going to tell this story, it has to be told in a way that can't be dismissed or distorted. I posted nothing more on social media. I didn't reply to the messages piling up in my inbox. I just went quiet, letting Lydia and her supporters believe they had won, allowing them to settle into their false victory. They thought my silence meant defeat. They had forgotten that the quietest storms are always the ones gathering the most strength. The coffee shop Gryson chose for the meeting was one of those independent places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, the kind of place where people actually worked rather than just posing with expensive drinks. I arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a tea I didn't really want, and sat at a corner table to watch the door. When Emma Jiang walked in at 3 p.m. on the dot, something about her felt familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. She was probably around 35, dressed in dark jeans and a blazer that conveyed professionalism, without corporate stiffness. Her straight black hair pulled back in a low ponytail. She scanned the room, spotted me, and walked over with a shy smile that sparked a memory I couldn't quite grasp. "Gillian Lowe?" she asked, holding out her hand. "I'm Emma Jiang. Thanks for agreeing to meet." We sat down, and she took out a notepad and a small recorder, placing them both on the table between us. "I always like to be transparent about recording conversations, even preliminary ones. It protects us both. Is that okay with you?" I nodded, appreciating the forthrightness, and she pressed the record button before leaning back in her chair and studying my face with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said finally, that shy smile reappearing. "I was Emma Cheen back then before I took my mother's maiden name. I sat 3 rows behind you in Year 11 English in Mrs. Patterson's class, the one where we had to do oral presentations every month." The memory surfaced slowly like something rising from deep water. A quiet girl in glasses, always sitting by herself, always the last to be picked for group projects. And Lydia, who was a first year when I was a second year holding court with her friends in the canteen, making cruel jokes about anyone they deemed beneath them. "Cheen the Zero," I said softly, the nickname coming back to me with a pang of shame. They called me that because I got a 0 on a presentation I was too terrified to give in front of them. Emma finished her tone. Matter of fact, but with an undercurrent of irony. "Your sister and her friends made my life a misery because I was the quiet Asian girl who didn't fight back. They'd do the pulled eye gesture when I walked past. They'd mock my accent even though I was born here. They'd steal my lunch, saying they were worried I'd brought something disgusting from home. The presentation was supposed to be on my family history. I'd worked on it for weeks, but when I got up to present and saw them in the back row already laughing, I froze. I couldn't speak. I just stood there until Mrs. Patterson let me sit down. 0 on the assignment. 2 months later, I changed schools. "Emma, I'm so sorry. I should have said something, done something." She held up a hand, stopping me. "You were dealing with your own version of Lydia's cruelty just at home instead of at school. I know that now. But at the time, I used to wonder why the smart, kind girl who helped me with my calculus homework never stepped in when her sister was humiliating me in public." She leaned forward, her expression shifting to something harder, more focused. "I saw what happened at your sister's wedding. A friend sent me the video someone took, and I've been following Lydia's career for 3 years. Ever since I started specializing in workplace misconduct investigations, I've been waiting for her to make a slip that would reveal her true character in a way I could document. You just handed me that opportunity. So Emma was the mystery friend who had sent that text after the wedding. The pieces were falling into place. She took a folder out of her bag and slid it across the table. I'm not interested in writing a hit piece fueled by family drama or old grudges. I'm interested in a legitimate investigation into intellectual property theft, corporate accountability, and how people like your sister get ahead by stealing from people like you and me. If you provide me with the evidence, I will independently verify every fact. I will interview colleagues from both firms, I will hire my own forensic analyst to confirm the metadata, and I will get a legal review before publication. This will not be a blog rant that can be dismissed as bitter gossip. It will be airtight journalism that meets every ethical standard, the kind of piece Lydia won't be able to wriggle out of with lawsuits or spin. I opened the folder and was met with published articles she had written over the past 5 years. Each one exposed a case of workplace theft or misconduct. Each one was meticulously documented with multiple sources and expert verification. And each one had resulted in real consequences, dismissals, changes in company policy, even criminal charges in one case. My reputation is built on accuracy, Emma continued. I don't publish anything I can't prove 3 different ways. I've been sued twice, and both cases were thrown out because my work was irrefutable. That's the standard I'm offering you. I closed the folder, the weight of the decision settling on me. If this goes public, it won't just hurt Lydia. She's pregnant, Emma. She has a husband who might leave her a baby who will grow up with this story attached to its mother's name. And how many innocent people at her company who had nothing to do with this? My mother taught me to seek justice, not destruction. How can I be sure this won't just be revenge dressed up as journalism? Emma didn't answer right away, and I appreciated that she was taking the question seriously instead of dismissing my concerns. That's exactly why I will write it responsibly, she said finally. I will focus on the actions and the pattern of behavior, not character assassination. I will present documented facts. Analysis shows materials matching earlier work by Gillian Lowe, not Lydia Hart is a lying thief. I will give her every opportunity to respond to present her side of the story. If she owns up to it and demonstrates genuine accountability, that will be part of the narrative too, a story of redemption and growth. But if she continues to lie, to double down on the false accusations against you, that's also part of the story. Either way, the truth needs to be told in a way that can't be spun or ignored. I thought about the USB stick I'd left on my father's dining table, about Lydia's desperate 2 a.m. phone call, about the social media post where she'd painted me as mentally unstable and jealous. I thought about my mother's video, her voice urging me to choose justice over revenge, to seek truth over destruction. I took out my phone and initiated the airdrop process, watching the progress bar as years of documentation transferred to Emma's device. This is everything. Sarah's forensic analysis, my mother's recordings, the timeline documentation, the entire paper trail. But you have to promise me one thing. This is about truth, not revenge. If you're doing this to settle a score with Lydia, I need to know now. Emma looked me in the eye, her expression serious. I won't lie and say I don't have personal feelings about your sister, but I am a journalist first. The truth is the only currency I deal in, because the moment I compromise it for my own satisfaction, I lose the thing that makes my work meaningful. I promise you it will be fair, factual, and focused on accountability. I had handed a loaded story to a woman who knew how to aim it. Now all I could do was trust that the truth was sharp enough to cut with precision. 3 days after I handed everything I had to Emma, I came home from the supermarket to find my father's car parked in front of my building. My heart immediately started to race. He had never visited me here, not once in the 3 years I'd lived in this place. The fact that he was here now meant something had shifted, meant he was desperate enough to break the unspoken rule that had kept us in our separate corners since my mother's death. I walked up the stairs carrying my shopping and found him standing by my door, his posture rigid with a barely contained anger. He was dressed in his usual business casual attire, smart trousers, and a polo shirt that suggested he'd come straight from the golf course or a meeting. And his face had the expression I'd learned to read as a child, the one that meant someone was about to get a lecture for disappointing him. "We need to talk," he said, not asking, not requesting but demanding. I unlocked the door, and he followed me inside without waiting for an invitation. His presence immediately made my small flat feel smaller, more claustrophobic. He didn't sit on my second-hand sofa or pull out one of my mismatched kitchen chairs. Instead, he walked straight to the window overlooking the car park, standing with his back to me, his shoulders tense. "I know what you're doing," he said, his voice cold and controlled in that way that had always been more frightening than shouting. "I know you've met with that journalist, Emma Jiang. I know you're planning to air our family's private business in public. I'm here to make you an offer, and you'd be wise to take it." He turned to face me then, and I saw something in his expression I'd rarely witnessed, genuine fear, thinly veiled by aggression. "Stop this now today, and I'll give you the inheritance your grandmother left. All £300,000 of it. You can have it. Disappear. Start over somewhere far away from here. Live comfortably. Buy that bakery you always used to talk about, or don't. Just live your life away from all of this." I placed the shopping bags on the counter, taking my time, letting the silence stretch. "Or what? Or you can continue on this vengeful crusade and lose what's left of your family for good. Lydia is already devastated pregnant and at risk of being unemployed. Your stepmother isn't speaking to you, and I will make sure that every door that might ever open for you in this city remains firmly shut. I still have connections, Gillian. I can make your life very difficult." I leaned back against the kitchen counter, watching the man who raised me, and asked the question that really mattered. "Why are you really here? You don't care about family, you never have. You didn't care when Mum was dying alone except for me. You didn't care when Lydia was stealing my work. You didn't care at the wedding when you called me the shame of the family. So what's really scaring you now?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might stick to his script, that he might continue to pretend this was all about protecting family unity. But then the mask dropped, and I saw pure self-interest underneath. Because if you keep digging, if you bring journalists and auditors and public scrutiny to this family, you won't just expose Lydia. You'll expose me. The words came out harsh and defensive. The Community Development Fund I've been managing for the last 5 years has had some irregularities. I didn't steal, not exactly, but I diverted £80,000 to help Lydia with the deposit on her house. I was planning to pay it back, but with the wedding expenses and everything that's happening now, I haven't been able to replace it yet. He stepped towards me, his voice taking on a pleading tone I had never heard before. "If there's an investigation into this family right now, if auditors start looking into everything I do, they will find those transfers. I could be facing criminal charges, Gillian. Embezzlement of public funds. I could go to prison." The confession hung in the air between us, and something crystallized in my understanding. For all these years, I had told myself he favored Lydia out of love, that maybe she was just more lovable than I was, more deserving of his attention and support. But now I saw the truth with painful clarity. He didn't favor Lydia out of love. He favored whoever served his interests, whoever made him look good, whoever he could control and manipulate to maintain the image he wanted to project. A strange calm settled over me, the kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself about who people really are. "You want to know why I'm doing this?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. It's not revenge, though. God knows I'd be justified. It's not even about the career you helped Lydia steal, though that matters. It's because Mum died thinking she had failed me, believing she wasn't strong enough to protect me from you. When the truth is, she's the only one in this family who never failed me. She was the only one who loved me unconditionally without calculating what I could do for her reputation. I walked to the door and opened it, my hand steady on the knob. You stole my inheritance. You enabled Lydia to steal my work. You threatened a dying woman into silence when she tried to defend me. You made her last months of life a misery of guilt over your choices. And now you want me to disappear quietly so you can avoid the consequences for embezzling money from a fund meant to help people in need. My father's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. So that's your answer. You're going to destroy your own family. No, Dad. I'm not taking your money. I'm not disappearing. I'm going to do exactly what Mum was too tired and too sick to do. I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you really are, not who you pretend to be at Chamber of Commerce meetings or charity golf tournaments, but who you are when no one is watching. His expression hardened into something cold and final. Then you're no daughter of mine. The words should have hurt, but instead I felt something like relief, as if a burden I'd carried my entire life had finally been lifted. I stopped being your daughter the day you decided I was worth less than Lydia, less than your reputation, less than your comfort. I'm just accepting it now. Now get out of my flat. He stood there for another second, perhaps expecting me to break, to take back my words, to crumble under the weight of his rejection as I always had before. When I didn't move, didn't speak, just held the door open with an impassive face. He walked past me without another word. I closed the door behind him and locked it. Then I stood with my back against it, my heart pounding, but my resolve as firm as rock. He had offered me silence for money, but some truths are worth more than gold, and I had just priced my own at invaluable. After my father left, I spent the rest of that evening sitting at my kitchen table with my mother's recipe box open in front of me, running my fingers over her handwriting on those worn index cards. Each recipe brought back a memory, her hands teaching me how to fold dough, her voice explaining why you should never overmix muffin batter, her smile when something came out of the oven perfectly. The next morning, I made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge or justice or proving a point to anyone. I decided to bake. Using a portion of the £50,000 my mother had secretly saved for me, I rented a space in a small commercial kitchen that a local catering service only used during the week. The evenings and weekends were mine for £300 a month. I bought basic equipment, quality ingredients, and started testing my mother's recipes. Her cinnamon rolls, which were legendary at church bake sales, her lemon bars, which neighbours requested every summer, her chocolate chip biscuits, which somehow tasted of childhood and comfort in every bite. I named my little venture Rose's Legacy Bakery, and had a simple sign printed with my mother's picture on it, the one from her 50th birthday, where she was laughing at something just out of frame, her face lit up with joy. That Saturday morning, I packed everything into my car and drove to the Riverside Farmers Market, setting up in a small stall between a vegetable grower and a woman who made artisanal soaps. I didn't have fancy packaging or professional signage. I had my mother's baking in disposable containers with handwritten labels and prices that barely covered my costs. But when the first customer, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, bought a box of cinnamon rolls and asked about the picture, I told her the truth. My mother was a nurse and a volunteer, and she dedicated her life to taking care of others. And these were her recipes, her legacy, the love she put into every batch. The woman's eyes filled with tears. My mother had a recipe box too. She's been gone 10 years, and I still can't bring myself to open it. She bought 3 more containers to share with her book club. By midday, I was sold out. Not because my baking was revolutionary or because I was some culinary genius, but because people responded to its authenticity. The simple story of a daughter honoring her mother's memory through the act of creation instead of destruction. The second weekend was busier. Word had spread somehow, and people started showing up specifically looking for Rose's legacy. But what shocked me was when Mrs. Arden approached my stall. She was an elderly woman I vaguely recognized from my mother's church. She picked up a packet of lemon bars and said Rose used to bring these to my husband when he was dying of cancer. Every Tuesday for 6 months, she'd show up at our door with these lemon bars and sit with him so I could go to the supermarket or just take a walk and breathe. She never asked for anything, never made a fuss, just showed up. And then Mr. Shah came by and told me how my mother had babysat his 3 children for free every Thursday night for 2 years, so his wife, a single mother after a difficult divorce, could work a second job to make ends meet. Your mum wouldn't take a penny, he said, shaking his head, kicking his pal. She'd say seeing my kids happy was reward enough. A young woman named Rachel, who couldn't have been more than 25, told me how my mother had tutored her in maths all through secondary school after every other tutor had given up. I have a learning disability, and everyone treated me like I was stupid. Rose treated me like I was smart, but just learned differently. I'm an accountant today because of her. Story after story. Weekend after weekend, I learned about the breadth and depth of my mother's quiet kindness. She had impacted dozens of lives in ways she had never publicized, never used for social advantage or reputation building. She just saw needs and met them, saw pain and soothed it, saw people and loved them. Mrs. Grant, who now came every Saturday, told the other vendors, Rose's daughter is nothing like what that family says about her. She's her mother's child through and through. The community began to form its own opinion of me based on what they saw, not what they were told. And I felt something shifting in the way people looked at me, no longer with pity, but with respect. On my 6th weekend at the market, a distinguished-looking man in his 70s approached my stall near closing time. He introduced himself as Robert Martinez, and the name sounded familiar, though I couldn't place why. He looked at my mother's photo for a long moment before he spoke. 15 years ago, my wife Helen had severe postnatal depression after our daughter was born, he said quietly. She couldn't bond with the baby, couldn't sleep, could barely function. The doctors prescribed medication, but what saved her life was your mother. Rose volunteered with a postnatal support program, and she came to our house 3 times a week for 4 months. She held the baby so Helen could rest. She listened to Helen talk about the darkness she was feeling. She reminded my wife that what she was experiencing was an illness, not a moral failing. His voice cracked with emotion. When Helen finally came back to herself, when she could look at our daughter and feel love instead of terror. We tried to thank your mother properly. We offered money. We offered to make a donation in her name. We offered everything we could think of. She refused it all. She said the reward is seeing Helen smile again. That's all the gratitude I need. He took a business card from his wallet and handed it to me. Robert Martinez, CEO Martinez Holdings. I recognize the name now. He was one of the wealthiest men in the region, known for his philanthropic work. I've wanted to repay that debt ever since, he said. I'd like to make you a proposal. I will donate £200,000 to establish a foundation in your mother's name, the Rose and Gillian Foundation. Its focus will be on helping middle-aged women re-enter the workforce after family caregiving responsibilities, giving them the support and resources they need to rebuild their careers after sacrificing them for family. You would run it, and you would make all the decisions about how the money is used. Your mother gave my family a second chance at happiness. Let me give you the resources so you can offer that gift to others. I stood there with a half-empty tray of biscuits in my hands, tears streaming down my face, unable to speak. Not because of the money, though, that was staggering, but because he had found a way to turn my pain into purpose, to turn my mother's legacy into something that would keep growing long after we were both gone. My mother had planted seeds of kindness her whole life. I was just beginning to harvest the forest she had grown. Emma called me on a Monday evening to let me know the article was going live the next morning. It's being pushed live at 6 a.m. on 3 platforms simultaneously, she said. I wanted you to have a heads up so you're not caught off guard. And Gillian, I want you to brace yourself. This is going to be big. The story is too compelling, too well documented. People are going to have strong reactions. I barely slept that night. At 5:45 a.m., I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, refreshing the news sites until the article appeared precisely at 6 a.m. The headline hit like a physical blow. The woman they called a loser, how one sister built her career on another's stolen ideas. I read all 3,500 words with my heart pounding, seeing my life laid out in clinical detail. Emma had kept her promise. The piece was devastatingly thorough without being cruel. She laid out Sarah's metadata analysis in terms anyone could understand, included quotes from 3 former colleagues who confirmed my innovative thinking and strategic approach, showed screenshots of Lydia's own social media posts that contradicted her claims in the timeline, and presented side-by-side comparisons of my email drafts and Lydia's presentations. The evidence was irrefutable, presented with such careful documentation that even someone predisposed to doubt would struggle to find a flaw in the narrative. What struck me most was how Emma described me in the piece. She didn't paint me as a victim or a martyr. She presented me as a professional whose work had been misappropriated, quoting my explanations of marketing strategy in a way that demonstrated expertise rather than resentment. The article never called Lydia a thief or used inflammatory language. It simply presented the facts and let readers draw their own conclusions. By the time I left for the farmers' market that morning, the article had 20,000 views. When I checked again at midday, it was at 200,000. By 3 p.m., as I was packing up my stall, it had hit 500,000. My phone had been buzzing all day with notifications I was ignoring. But when I finally looked, I saw that social media had exploded. A hashtag had started trending, hashtag I stand with Gillian. Marketing professionals were sharing the article with outraged commentary on workplace ethics. Business school professors were posting about using it as a case study. Podcasters were requesting interviews. The comments sections were filled with people sharing their own stories of stolen credit and misappropriated work. This is every woman's nightmare, read one widely shared comment. Doing the invisible work while someone else gets the visible credit. Former colleagues from both my old firm and Lydia's began to come forward with their own observations. 2 people who had been in interviews at Mittel and Associates reported that Lydia had described their ideas during the interviews as if they were her own original concepts. The story was expanding beyond our family drama into a larger conversation about intellectual property, workplace ethics, and the dynamics of who gets credit when authorship is contested. I was loading the last box into my car when my phone rang with Lydia's number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "You destroyed me." Her voice was hoarse, raw, as if she'd spent hours either crying or screaming. I couldn't tell which. "The company called this morning. I'm fired. For real this time. Effective immediately. No severance, no letters of recommendation, nothing. Marcus is talking to a divorce solicitor. His parents called me a grifter to my face. There are people outside my house taking pictures, reporters trying to get a statement. My baby is going to grow up knowing its mother was made into a public laughingstock because of you. I leaned against my car, feeling strangely calm, despite the venom in her voice. I didn't destroy you, Lydia. I just stopped letting you build your life on top of my buried one. Everything in that article is true. You know it's true. You could have owned up to it at any point during the company investigation, during our 2 a.m. phone call. At every opportunity you had to choose honesty, you chose to double down. You chose to post on social media calling me mentally unstable. You chose to keep lying. And now you're facing what I've been facing for years. People judging you based on facts. I'm 8 weeks pregnant and unemployed, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. What am I supposed to do? The question hung in the air, and I thought of all the times I had asked myself the same thing. When I walked away from my career to care for our mother and came back to find my professional reputation in tatters. When I was struggling to pay my rent from my meagre savings. When she had been accepting accolades for work I had created while I was being called the shame of the family. The same thing I did when you and Dad left me with nothing, I said quietly. You figure it out. But this time, Lydia, try doing it honestly. Try building something that's actually yours instead of something stolen from someone else. Try being the mother your child deserves. I hate you, she whispered. I know. But one day when you're ready to be honest with yourself, you'll realize I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourself. I just stopped covering for you. She hung up without another word. I drove home through the late afternoon traffic, watching the View count on Emma's article tick past 600,000. My phone was full of interview requests, messages from former colleagues and emails from women sharing their own stories of stolen credit. The article had touched a nerve that went far beyond my personal situation. That night, a marketing podcast with over 1 million subscribers announced they were doing a full episode on intellectual property theft in professional services, using my story as the centerpiece. A television producer reached out about the rights for a documentary. 3 universities requested permission to include the case in their business ethics curricula. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading through social and professional networks faster than anyone could have predicted. Lydia's carefully constructed image was unraveling in real time, and there was nothing she, my father, or anyone else could do to stop it. The truth had gone viral, and there wasn't an algorithm in the world that could bury it again, no matter how hard they tried to rebrand reality. 2 days after Emma's article went viral, I was reading through the endless comments on the various platforms where it had been posted when one particular post caught my eye. The username was Concerned Citizen 47, and the comment was brief but explosive. If you're investigating the daughter, you should be looking at the father too. Weird fund transfers from the Riverside Community Development Fund in 2022. Check the public records. Something's not right there. Within hours, others had taken up the challenge. The comments section turned into a crowdsourced investigation with amateur sleuths and journalists posting links to quarterly reports from the community fund. The fund was supposed to be transparent, a model of public accountability, but several people noted that the 2022 and 2023 reports contained unusually vague line items: administrative redistribution, £15,000, emergency community loans, £20,000, consultancy fees for various amounts, none with clear recipients or documentation of services rendered. A forensic accountant who identified herself as a CPA with 20 years of experience offered to analyze the publicly available information. She posted a detailed thread explaining the transfers in language anyone could understand. These patterns are consistent with embezzlement or misappropriation of funds. The timing, the amounts, the vague descriptions. It all sets off alarm bells. Someone should be looking into where this money actually went. By the end of the week, the regional office of HMRC had apparently been monitoring the growing public concern and announced a formal audit of the Riverside Community Development Fund. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly my father's face started appearing on the evening news. The image he had so carefully cultivated as a community leader was now under intense scrutiny. The results of the audit came back faster than anyone expected, likely because much of the groundwork had already been done by the online investigators. What they found was damning. £80,000 transferred over an 18-month period from the community fund to accounts linked to a shell company called Heart Consulting Services. The company had no employees, no office, and provided no actual services. It existed only on paper, and its bank account was co-owned by my father and Lydia. The money had been withdrawn in a series of transfers and used as the deposit for Lydia's house in the affluent neighborhood where she'd been living when everything fell apart. My father had apparently planned to replace the money gradually, so it would look like a short-term loan no one would notice. But he'd never managed to pay any of it back. And now it was exposed for what it was: theft from a fund specifically designed to help low-income residents with housing assistance. The irony was almost too perfect. My father had stolen money meant to help poor people afford homes so that his daughter could live in luxury. The local paper ran the story with a headline that must have killed him. Community leader accused of stealing from the poor to enrich his family. They interviewed residents who had been denied assistance from the fund people who were told there wasn't enough money to help with their rent or mortgage payments, while my father was funneling cash to Lydia. That night, my doorbell rang. When I looked through the peephole, I saw my father standing in the hall. And the man I saw bore little resemblance to the one who had shown up weeks earlier, with threats and ultimatums. This version of my father was stooped, his face ashen, his expensive polo shirt crumpled, as if he'd been wearing it for days. I opened the door and he practically stumbled inside, looking around my modest flat, like a man seeing it for the first real time. The second-hand furniture, the small kitchen, the life I had built from nothing while he had been living in comfort, bought with stolen money. "I'm going to lose everything," he said, his voice choked. "The house, my reputation, possibly 5 to 10 years in a federal prison. Your stepmother filed for divorce this morning. I'm 64 years old, Gillian. I'll get out of this an old man with nothing, no one, and no future." Then he did something I had never seen him do in my entire life. He cried. Not tears of anger and frustration, not the calculated tears of manipulation, but genuine racking sobs that shook his shoulders and made him sink onto my sofa as if his legs could no longer hold him. "I'm begging you," he said through his tears. "If you make a statement to the prosecutors, tell them you don't want to press charges. If you show them the family has reconciled, they might offer a plea deal. Community service instead of prison probation, instead of incarceration. Please, Gillian. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm asking for it anyway." I stood there watching him fall apart, feeling the weight of holding someone's fate in my hands, and thinking of my mother's video message about justice versus revenge, of Pastor Ruth's guidance to choose wisely. This man had turned my childhood into a competition I was never meant to win. He had stolen my inheritance, enabled the theft of my work, threatened my dying mother, and called me the shame of the family in front of hundreds of people. And now he wanted mercy. "I'll make you a deal, Dad," I said finally, my voice steady and clear. "You publicly admit what you did. Everything, every theft, every lie, every manipulation. You pay back every penny to that fund, even if you have to sell the house to do it. You go to Mum's grave and you apologize to her out loud where I can hear you say the words. Then you leave me alone for the rest of your life. You don't call, you don't write, you don't show up at my bakery stall or my flat. You let me live my life as if you don't exist." He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears, and nodded slowly. "You do that," I continued, "and I will tell the prosecutor that I believe in rehabilitation over mere punishment, that I think accountability and restitution matter more than revenge. I can't promise what they'll decide, but I can promise that." He started to get up, perhaps to hug me or thank me, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "And Dad, the next time you're tempted to call someone worthless, the next time you think about measuring someone's value by their job title or their bank balance, you remember this moment. You remember that the loser daughter you were so ashamed of is the one who just saved you from dying in prison." And he left without another word, and I locked the door behind him, touching my mother's cross necklace, and thinking about how strange it was that mercy could feel both generous and devastating at the same time. He had spent my entire life teaching me that I was worthless. I had just spent one conversation teaching him the price of his own choices. The official invitation from Riverside Town Council arrived by recorded delivery 3 days after my father's visit. They were convening an emergency public hearing about the Community Development Fund, and I was being invited to testify as an affected party and a witness to relevant facts. The hearing was set for the following Thursday at 7 p.m. in the main council chamber. I spent the days leading up to it, working with Pastor Ruth, to organize the documents into a clear timeline. We created a simple presentation anyone could follow my grandmother's original will, showing the equal split, the forced signature my mother had been pressured into signing, email exchanges, documenting the theft of my work and financial records, showing the suspicious transfers from the community fund. Ruth helped me rehearse my testimony, not to memorize a script, but to organize my thoughts so I could speak clearly under pressure. On Thursday night, I arrived at the town hall 30 minutes early. The car park was already packed, and I could see news vans with satellite broadcasting equipment parked along the street. Inside the council chamber was standing room only, with people lining the back wall and sitting on folding chairs that had been set up in the aisles. I recognized a few faces. Residents my mother had helped, vendors from the farmers' market, former colleagues who had seen Emma's article. But most were strangers, community members who felt betrayed by what my father had done with the funds meant to serve them. I took a seat in the front row, wearing a simple navy blue dress, and my mother's cross necklace carrying a photo of her that I'd brought from home. The photo showed her in her volunteer nurse's uniform, smiling at the camera, with that look of gentle strength that defined her. I placed it on the seat beside me, as if she were there in spirit, if not in body. The council members filed in their faces, serious and businesslike, clearly aware that the media attention meant every word spoken that night would be scrutinized. The council chair, a woman named Margaret Sands, whom I'd never met, called the session to order and explained that they would hear testimony regarding the allegations of fund misappropriation, then vote on appropriate action. When she called my name, I stood and walked to the podium, my mother's photo in one hand and my organized documents in the other. The room fell silent, and I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, but I focused on the council members and began to speak. "My name is Gillian Lowe. I am here tonight not to seek revenge on my family, but to speak truths that my mother was unable to before she died." My voice was steady, clearer than I expected. I walked them through the timeline, methodically displaying the documents as I cited them. My grandmother's will. The signature my mother was coerced into providing the pattern of intellectual property theft that had been documented and verified, the financial records that showed the diversion of £80,000 from community funds to accounts linked to my father and sister. I spoke for 12 minutes, and in that time the room remained absolutely silent, except for my voice. As I came to a conclusion, I put down my papers and spoke directly to the council members. I am not here because I want to see anyone punished for the sake of it. I am here because my mother spent her final months knowing these truths and feeling powerless to voice them. She died believing she had failed me by staying silent, by choosing what she thought was family peace over what was actual justice. I am speaking now for her and for everyone in this community who trusted my father with resources meant to help the most vulnerable among us. I paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd and seeing people nodding in agreement. Justice isn't about making people suffer. It's about accountability. It's about acknowledging that actions have consequences and that those consequences matter to real people. The money my father took wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It was housing assistance for families on the verge of homelessness. It was help for people who had nowhere else to turn. Those people deserved better. This community deserved better. And my mother deserved better than to die carrying the weight of someone else's crimes. I walked back to my seat, my hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading, and watched as my father was called to the podium. He looked as if he had aged 10 years in the last 2 weeks. His face was gaunt, his shoulders slumped, and when he gripped the podium, I could see his hands shake. His statement was brief but devastating in its admission. I abused my position of trust. I misappropriated funds for my own benefit. I pressured my late ex-wife into disadvantaging one child for the benefit of another. I have lied to this community, and I have lied to myself about what I was doing. His voice broke, and he had to pause before he could continue. I publicly apologized to the residents whose trust I violated and whose needs I ignored. I apologized to my daughter Gillian, whom I have wronged repeatedly, and whom I called the shame of the family when she was the only one acting with integrity. And I apologized to my late wife Rose, whose kindness I exploited and whose memory I have dishonored. The council deliberated for less than 30 minutes before returning with their decision. They voted unanimously to remove my father from all positions related to community funds, to refer the case to the public prosecutor for criminal proceedings, and to bar any member of our immediate family from managing public resources in the future. They also voted to implement new oversight procedures and mandatory audits to prevent a similar situation from happening again. As I was leaving the building, people I didn't even know approached me. A woman in her 70s with kind eyes took my hand and said, "Your mother would be so proud of you, dear. You didn't just speak for yourself tonight. You spoke for all of us who have been silenced, who have been told to be quiet for the sake of peace. Thank you for having the courage to tell the truth." A man who looked like he'd come straight from a building site said, "My family was denied help last year because they said the fund was dry. Now we know why. Thank you for making it right." I drove home as the sun was setting, exhausted, but feeling something I hadn't felt in years, the sense that I had honored my mother's memory in a way that truly mattered. The chamber had heard his confession, but I had heard something else in his voice, the sound of a man finally understanding that actions have consequences and silence has victims. I was walking towards my car, emotionally drained from the hearing, when I spotted someone sitting on the curb at the far end of the car park. Even from a distance, something about the hunched posture looked familiar. As I got closer, I realized it was Lydia. She looked nothing like the polished professional who had introduced me as an unemployed loser at her wedding just 2 months ago. She was wearing grey jogging bottoms and an oversized hoodie, her blonde hair pulled into a messy ponytail, her face completely free of makeup. She looked very young sitting there on the concrete curb, and very scared and very alone. When she saw me approaching, she didn't jump up or run away or level accusation or make excuses. She just looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed, and said, "Can we talk? Please, I should have kept walking." I should have got in my car and driven away from this final confrontation. But something in her voice, something raw and broken, made me stop. I sat down on the curb beside her, both of us facing out into the near-empty car park as the last of the hearing attendees drove away. "You won," Lydia said, her voice flat and exhausted. "I've lost everything. My job probably for good in this industry. Marcus barely speaks to me. His solicitor sent me the papers yesterday. My father is going to prison, and I'm bringing a baby into this complete nightmare. Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted?" I turned to look at her profile, saw the way her jaw was clenched to hold back tears, the way her hands were gripping the fabric of her hoodie, as if she needed something to hold on to. "If you think this was about winning or losing, you still don't get it," I said quietly. "This was never about you losing Lydia. It was about me stopping being invisible. It was about me refusing to let you and Dad bury me while you built monuments to yourselves on top of my grave." She made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I know. God, I finally know. I've had a lot of time to think these last few weeks, sitting alone in that house while Marcus stays at his parents', staring at my phone full of messages from people who think I'm a fraud. And you know what the worst part is? They're right. I am a fraud." The tears came then, not the calculated weeping I'd seen from her before, but a genuine grief that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken. "I'm so sorry, Jill. Not because I got caught, not because my life fell apart, but because I finally understand what I did. I stole your work, yes, but that's not even the worst of it. I stole your life. I let Dad erase you from the family story, and I helped him do it because it was so much easier than standing up to him, than risking his approval by defending you." She turned to face me fully, her eyes searching mine. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me. I honestly don't know if I deserve it. But I need you to know that I finally get it. I get you, who you really are, what I took from you, what Mum was trying to protect you from when she went quiet about Dad's manipulation." We sat in silence for a long moment. Two sisters who had been strangers for most of our lives, finally being honest with each other. "I can't forgive you today, Lydia," I said, finally surprised at the calm in my voice. "Maybe not for a long time. Maybe never. I don't know yet. But I can give you something else. I can give you a chance to become someone worthy of forgiveness." She looked at me confused, and with something that might have been hope. "Mr. Martinez is funding the Rose and Gillian Foundation to help women rebuild their careers after family caregiving. Women who sacrificed their professional lives for family. Women who were knocked down and are trying to get back up. I want you to work there." "You want me to wait what?" "Not as an employee," I clarified. "As a volunteer. No salary, no title, no business cards or LinkedIn updates, just service. A full year of showing up and helping people who have been knocked down in the same way you knocked me down. Women who have had their work stolen, their contributions, ignored, their value questioned. If you can do that with genuine humility, if you can help rebuild what people like our father have spent years tearing down, then maybe, just maybe, we can talk about forgiveness." Lydia stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "After everything I did, you'd let me be part of something with Mum's name on it. Mum believed in second chances," I said, touching the cross necklace at my throat. She gave Dad one too many, let him manipulate her kindness over and over. But she wasn't wrong to believe that people can change, that redemption is possible. She just bet on the wrong person. I stood up, brushing the dust off my dress. "This is your second chance, Lydia. You only get one. Don't waste it by half-arsing it or just going through the motions. Don't waste it by treating it like community service hours you have to get through. If you're going to do this, do it because you actually want to become someone different than who you've been. She stood up too, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. What if I mess it up? What if I'm not good at it? Then you'll fail, I said simply, and you'll have to live with that, just like I had to live with all the ways you and Dad failed me. But at least you'll have tried. At least you'll have chosen something other than the easy way out. When do I start? The foundation officially launches next month. Show up on opening day and we'll find out if you're serious. She nodded, wiping her eyes on the sleeve of her hoodie. Thank you. For this. I know I don't deserve it. You don't, I agreed. But Mum would have given it to you anyway, so I'm giving it in her name, not yours. Don't make me regret it. I walked to my car and drove away, watching Lydia in the rearview mirror as she stood alone in that car park. And I thought about what Pastor Ruth had said about mercy and justice, about how the hardest thing is knowing when to extend grace to the people who have hurt you. Forgiveness isn't a moment. It's 1,000 small choices not to let hate win. And I had just made the first one. 2 weeks after the town council hearing, Pastor Ruth called, asking if I could come to her office for a formal meeting. There's someone I'd like you to meet, she said, her voice telling me the importance of the moment. The family solicitor. It's time. When I arrived at the church, Ruth was waiting with a man in his 60s, dressed in a grey suit, his briefcase open on the table between them. He introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, the solicitor who had managed my grandmother's estate for 3 decades. Ruth gestured for me to sit, and I could see something like relief in her eyes, as if she'd been carrying a burden for a long time, and was finally able to set it down. Your grandmother was a shrewd woman. Ruth began, her hands folded in her lap. She knew your father's character long before your mother ever married him. She saw how he treated people, when he thought no one important was watching, how he measured their worth by bank accounts and job titles. When she made her will, the one that left £300,000 to be split between you and Lydia, she also created something else. A separate trust fund that no one knew about except me and Mr. Brennan here. The solicitor pulled a document from his briefcase. The paper was aged but still crisp, and he slid it across the table. I could see my grandmother's signature at the bottom, dated more than 30 years ago when I was just a child. The trust had very specific conditions, Ruth continued. The heir had to demonstrate what your grandmother called moral courage in the face of family pressure, and the ability to choose truth over convenience. She gave me full discretion as the trustee to determine when and if those conditions were met. And Gillian, I have been watching you very closely these last few months. Mr. Brennan opened an envelope and withdrew a bank statement that showed an account I never knew existed. The initial deposit had been £300,000, the same amount as the inheritance my father had stolen, but invested carefully over the years, it had grown to £1,470,000. I couldn't release the funds until I was sure you'd passed the final test. Ruth said, her voice soft but firm. Would you use the truth to heal or to hurt? You had every weapon you needed to utterly destroy your father and your sister. You could have sold your story to tabloids for more money. You could have sued them into bankruptcy. You could have reveled in their public humiliation, or posted about it on social media, turned their suffering into entertainment. She leaned forward, her eyes meeting mine. Instead, you told the truth and let the consequences unfold naturally. You gave your testimony without malice. You gave your sister a chance at redemption she hadn't earned. You showed your father mercy when he begged for it, even after everything he had done. That is what your grandmother meant by moral courage, the strength to seek justice without becoming cruel, to stand up for the truth without using it as a weapon. I felt tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the realization that my grandmother had foreseen all of this, had planned for it decades before it happened. "The money is yours now," Ruth said. "But more importantly, you've earned something money can't buy. You know exactly who you are, Gillian. You know your worth isn't determined by your father's opinion or your sister's theft or anyone else's judgment. That knowledge, that unshakable sense of self, that's the real inheritance." Mr. Brennan cleared his throat gently. "There is one more thing. Your grandmother included a letter to be given to the heir when the trust was activated. She wrote it before you were born, but when you read it, you'll understand she was writing it specifically for you." He handed me the time-yellowed envelope, my name written on the front in a script I barely remembered, but somehow recognized instinctively. I opened it with trembling hands and unfolded the single page inside. "To the grandchild who is reading this," the letter began, "you have faced a choice between being right and being kind, between justice and revenge, between truth and peace. If you are holding this letter, you have chosen wisely. Money can be stolen. Careers can be ruined. Reputations can be attacked. But character cannot be taken, only given away. You did not give yours away. Use these resources not just to rebuild your life, but to build a life worth living, one that your children's children will be proud to inherit. Not in money, but in example. The world will try to teach you that strength means hardness, that survival means becoming like those who hurt you. Prove them wrong. Be strong enough to remain soft, successful enough to remain generous, and hurt enough to remain kind anyway. With love, always, Grandma Grace." I sat there weeping, holding this letter from a woman who had been gone for more than a decade, feeling her love and wisdom reach across time to hold me up, just when I needed it most. "She saw him," I whispered. "She knew who he was, and she created a safeguard for whichever grandchild refused to become like him." "She did," Ruth confirmed. "The fund wasn't just money. It was a test and a blessing all at once." I signed the transfer documents with Mr. Brennan as my witness, and then I made my decisions quickly, knowing they were right, because they felt like something my grandmother and my mother would have done. £250,000 will go to the Rose Foundation. I told them to expand our reach and help more women. £250,000 will be used to fully reimburse the community fund. I know my father is supposed to do it, but I want those people to have their money back now, not whenever he gets around to it. And I'll keep the remaining £970,000 to secure my own future, to make sure I never again have to depend on anyone else's approval or charity." Ruth smiled, her eyes shining. "That's how you show generosity, not by hoarding what you've earned, but by sharing what you've been given. Your grandmother would be so proud." As I walked out of the church that afternoon, the paperwork in my bag and my grandmother's letter pressed to my heart, I understood something profound. Grandma Grace had left me more than money. She had left me proof that integrity echoes through generations, and I had just decided what my echo was going to sound like. 6 weeks after I offered Lydia a chance at redemption in that car park, my phone buzzed with a text message that took my breath away. "I've been volunteering at the foundation for a month now. I'd like to talk to you. Really talk. Not just apologize. Can we meet at Mum's old house? The new owner said I could use the kitchen for a few hours. I know it's a lot to ask." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keypad. The house we grew up in had been sold 8 months after my mother died, and I hadn't been back since the estate sale. The thought of stepping back into that kitchen, the place where my mother had taught me how to measure flour, mix dough, and understand that baking was an act of love made tangible, filled me with a mixture of longing and dread. I waited 2 days before I replied, Saturday 2 p.m. When I pulled up to the old house that Saturday afternoon, I sat in the car for a full 5 minutes, gathering my courage. The new owners had painted the house a different colour, a pale yellow instead of the cream it used to be, and put new shutters on the windows. But it was still unmistakably my childhood home, and walking up the front path felt like stepping back in time. Lydia opened the door, and I was struck by how different she looked. Her baby bump was now visible at 4 months, and she was dressed in jeans and a loose sweater, her hair pulled back simply. But it was the apron she was wearing that caught my eye. Our mother's apron, the one with the faded sunflower print that had hung on a hook by the stove for as long as I could remember. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. The kitchen seemed smaller than I remembered, as childhood homes always do, but the layout was the same. Lydia had everything we needed set out on the worktop: flour, sugar, butter, cinnamon. The old mixing bowls I recognized as part of our mother's collection that Lydia must have kept after the estate sale. "I don't expect you to forgive me today," Lydia said, her hands moving nervously over the counter. "Not even this year, maybe not ever. But I wanted to learn Mum's cinnamon roll recipe from you. I've realized something these last few weeks at the foundation. I spent so much time competing with you, trying to prove I was better than you, that I never learned the things Mum really wanted to teach us: how to make her recipes, how to be kind without expecting anything in return, how to measure worth by what you give instead of what you get." I put down my bag and washed my hands at the sink, the familiar routine calming my racing heart. "All right, let's start with the dough." We worked in silence at first, my hands showing hers the way our mother's hands had once shown mine. How much flour to add gradually so the dough doesn't get tough. How to knead until it's smooth and elastic without overworking it. How to know by touch when the texture is just right. As our hands moved in the familiar motions, something started to shift in the silence. It became less awkward and almost meditative, the rhythm of the work creating a space where words could finally flow naturally. "I'm in therapy now," Lydia said as we rolled out the dough. "Twice a week. My therapist had me write down all the ways my father made me feel like I had to be perfect, that I had to be better than you, that I had to constantly prove my worth. It took me 4 sessions to finish the list." She stilled her hands, resting them on the rolling pin. "I'm starting to understand that my insecurity wasn't your fault. It was a projection of his need to pit us against each other, so he could control us, make us compete for scraps of his approval." I brushed melted butter over the dough, then sprinkled the cinnamon sugar mixture the way my mother had taught me. "He made you believe your value came from being better than me, instead of just being you." "Yes," she whispered, and I let him. I chose that easy path, instead of questioning why love in our family had to be a competition. We rolled up the dough, carefully cut it into pieces, and arranged the rolls in the baking tin. As we put them in the oven and set the timer, the kitchen began to fill with the scent that defined my childhood: cinnamon, yeast, and butter. The smell of Saturday mornings and holiday breakfasts and my mother's love all made tangible. That's when we both started to cry. Not the angry or guilty tears we'd shed before, but something deeper. The shared grief of 2 daughters who had lost their mother and were only now, months too late, starting to understand what she had been trying to give them. "I miss her so much," Lydia said, her voice choked. "I never got to apologize to her for playing along with the way Dad treated you, for standing by while he called you worthless, for taking what was yours and letting him convince me I deserved it." I wiped my eyes on the corner of the sunflower apron. I spent years being angry at Mum for not standing up to Dad, more for not protecting me in the way I thought a mother should. But watching you struggle to stand up to him even now, seeing how hard it is to break free from his manipulation, even after everything that's happened, I finally understand. She wasn't weak. She was trapped in ways I couldn't see because I was trapped too. And she did the bravest thing she could. She left me the map, the USB drive, the evidence, the contacts for people who could help. She couldn't fight while she was alive, so she fought from beyond the grave. The timer pinged, and we took the cinnamon rolls out of the oven, golden brown and perfect, just like our mother used to make them. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where we'd eaten countless childhood meals, and ate hot cinnamon rolls with our fingers, not bothering with plates. For the first time in decades, we weren't sisters divided by competition and resentment. We were just two daughters, missing their mother, finding their way back to each other, in the space where her love had always been most present. Forgiveness isn't one conversation, I told Lydia, watching her stroke her growing belly with one hand as she ate with the other. It's 1,000 small moments where I choose not to hate you. This is one of those moments. She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. I'll earn the other 999, however long it takes. We couldn't get the lost years back. We couldn't undo the pain or erase the betrayal. But in our mother's kitchen, surrounded by the smell of cinnamon and kindness, we had found something better, a starting point. 3 months after that afternoon in our mother's kitchen, Lydia was a fixture at the Rose Foundation. She was there most days when I arrived, sitting with women twice her age, listening to their stories of interrupted careers and lost opportunities. She helped them update their CVs, practiced interview questions with them, and coordinated a support group for women dealing with workplace betrayal. She showed up even on days when her pregnancy left her exhausted, even when I could see the emotional toll of the work was wearing on her. One evening, as I was closing up the office, Lydia asked if we could talk. She looked nervous, fidgeting with the strap of her handbag. "I want to make a public apology video," she said bluntly. "Not because anyone is forcing me to, not because I'm trying to get my old life back, but because the women I'm helping here deserve to know that I understand what it means to be disbelieved, to have to start from scratch, to carry the weight of other people's judgment." A flicker of immediate skepticism rose in my chest. Lydia, public apologies can look like image rehabilitation. They can feel staged even when they're sincere. How do I know this is real and not just another calculated move? She looked at me steadily. You don't. But the women at the foundation do. They've watched me show up every day for 3 months. They've seen me cry in the loo when the stories get too heavy. They've heard me actually listen instead of just waiting for my turn to talk. Ask them if it's real. So I did. I called in 3 of the women who had been working most closely with Lydia Margaret, a 58-year-old former accountant trying to re-enter the workforce after caring for her husband through cancer treatment. Sophia, a 42-year-old who lost her teaching career when a colleague co-opted her curriculum redesign idea. And Patricia, a 61-year-old engineer whose ideas had been systematically credited to male colleagues for decades. Margaret spoke first. "Your sister is broken in the right way, open, not shattered. She's not trying to fix herself by helping us. She's helping us, Zibai, because she finally understands what was broken in you." Sophia added, "I've seen a lot of people do mandatory community service. Lydia isn't doing ours. She's doing the work, the real internal work, of becoming a different person." Patricia, who had been the most skeptical of Lydia when she first arrived, said simply, "She's earned her place here. Let her speak." So I gave Lydia permission, though I insisted on one condition. It had to be unscripted, raw, and completely honest. No PR team, no carefully crafted messaging, no attempts to soften the truth. She filmed it in one take in the foundation office, sitting in a simple chair against a plain white wall. She wore a plain grey sweater, no makeup. Her hair pulled back 5 months pregnant and showing. She looked directly into the camera and spoke for 10 minutes without a break. "My name is Lydia Hart," she began, her voice steady but unrehearsed. "And I built my career on work I stole from my sister Gillian Lowe. I'm not here to make excuses, to ask for sympathy, or to justify what I did. I'm here to take full and complete responsibility for the choices I made repeatedly over the course of 5 years." She detailed everything: how our father had convinced her that using my abandoned ideas wasn't really theft, how she had rationalized each appropriation by telling herself I had given up my right to the work when I left my career, how she had chosen comfort and advancement over integrity time and time again. She didn't spare herself or try to make herself sympathetic. "The hardest part isn't getting caught," she said, her voice wavering slightly but not breaking. "It's that now I understand the price of what I did. While I was collecting promotions and accolades and building a reputation, my sister was losing opportunities, losing credibility, losing years of her life that she can never get back. She sacrificed her career to care for our dying mother, and I used that sacrifice as an opportunity to take what was hers." Paused, placing a hand on her stomach. "I can't give those years back. I can't undo the damage. But I can do two things. I can tell the truth, and I can dedicate myself to helping others who have been silenced or stolen from, in the same way I silenced and stole from my sister. I volunteer at the Rose Foundation, named for our mother, which helps women rebuild their careers after caregiving or workplace injustice. If you have been a victim of intellectual property theft, if your work has been credited to someone else, if you have been disbelieved or dismissed, please reach out. You deserve support, and you deserve to have your truth heard." She ended simply, "I was wrong. I'm sorry. And I am trying every day to become someone worthy of that apology." We posted the video to the Foundation's social media and to Lydia's personal page. I watched the view count climb throughout the day: 10,000 by lunchtime, 50,000 by evening, 500,000 by the time I went to bed. By the next morning, it had reached 2 million. The comments were not universally positive, and I was glad for that. Unanimous praise would have felt false. Some people applauded Lydia's courage. Others said she was only sorry because she got caught. Many shared their own stories of stolen credit, co-opted ideas, and workplace betrayal. The conversation expanded beyond our specific situation to broader discussions about intellectual property, gender dynamics in career advancement, and the courage it takes to speak truth when your own family is the source of the injustice. The Foundation's phones and emails were overwhelmed. We received 347 new requests for assistance in 1 week. 3 universities contacted us, asking for permission to use our case as a teaching tool in their business ethics courses. A publisher emailed me asking if I'd consider writing a book about the experience. But what struck me most were the 5 women who came forward, former colleagues of Lydia's from different companies over the years, thanking me for exposing a pattern they had experienced but felt powerless to report. "She did it to me too," one wrote. "Took my proposal in a meeting and presented it as her own the next day. I complained to HR and was told I was being overly sensitive about a collaborative environment. Thank you for making people see that this is real, that it matters, and that it has consequences." The story had transcended 2 sisters and become something bigger. A conversation about systemic problems, about who gets credit, about the price women pay for being generous with their ideas in workplaces that reward visibility over substance. Lydia's apology didn't erase the past. Nothing could give me back the lost years, undo the humiliation, or restore what was taken. But it did something even better. It created a future where truth mattered more than reputation, where accountability mattered more than image, where being broken open by the truth was recognized as a greater strength than remaining closed off. And that I realized as I read messages from women finding their voices after years of silence was worth more than any revenge ever could be. A year after Lydia's apology video went viral, I stood in the newly renovated office of the Rose Foundation, looking at the plaque Robert Martinez had commissioned for the entrance, in memory of Rose Lowe, who taught us that the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. The foundation now had 3 full-time employees, in addition to our volunteers, and we had served over 200 women in 12 months. The walls were covered with photos, women at their new jobs, women receiving certificates from training programs, women smiling with the confidence that comes from being seen and supported. My phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. Another former colleague requesting to connect the 5th this week. A year ago, my professional network had been a graveyard of outdated contacts and unanswered messages. Now people sought me out, not with pity, but with respect. Not because of what was stolen from me, but because of what I had built afterwards. Regional business magazines had featured the foundation with headlines that still felt surreal when I read them. From unemployed to unstoppable, how one woman turned betrayal into a movement. I had reconnected with Sarah, who now sat on our advisory board. Marcus Grayson had introduced me to other philanthropists who had contributed both funding and expertise. But the connection that surprised me most was with David, a 52-year-old widower who had started volunteering at the foundation 6 months ago, teaching interview skills to women re-entering the workforce. He had lost his wife to breast cancer 3 years prior, and found a sense of purpose in helping others rebuild their lives after loss. We had started getting coffee after volunteer sessions, then occasional dinners. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, neither of us needed that. But it was something real and gentle and unhurried. For the first time in my adult life, I was building a relationship defined by what I wanted, not by what someone else took, expected, or demanded. I kept my mother's picture on my desk, the one from her 50th birthday, where she was laughing with pure joy. Sometimes when the office was quiet, I would talk to it. "We did it, Mum. We really did it. The foundation is helping women the way you always helped people quietly without fanfare, just by showing up when they need someone to believe in them." The office door opened and Lydia came in, carefully balancing a car seat. Tucked inside was 6-month-old Rose, named for the grandmother she would never know. When Lydia had called to tell me she'd chosen the name, I had cried for an hour. Tears of grief and gratitude all mixed up in a way I couldn't separate. "I know I'm early for our lunch," Lydia said, setting the car seat down gently. Rose wouldn't nap, and I thought maybe a change of scenery would help. I came around my desk to look at my niece, who had Lydia's blonde hair, but eyes that were a painful reminder of our mothers. "She's getting so big." "She's a terrible sleeper and an excellent screamer," Lydia said, but her voice was full of love. "Marcus jokes that she got my talent for demanding attention." Marcus. The very fact that Lydia could say her husband's name without pain was progress. They had been in intensive couples therapy for the past year, trying to work through the betrayal and lies that had nearly destroyed their relationship. It was slow, hard work, and there were still difficult days, but they were both committed to rebuilding something honest, even if it looked nothing like what they had before. Lydia continued to volunteer at the foundation 20 hours a week, fitting it around Rose's schedule and the online courses she was taking to finish a degree in social work. She would never have the corporate career she'd had before, and I could see her making peace with that. "I spent 10 years climbing a ladder that was leaning against the wrong building," she'd told me last month. "Now I'm building something on solid ground, even if it's smaller and slower. We had lunch together once a month now, sometimes just the two of us, sometimes with little Rose sleeping nearby. The conversations were still occasionally awkward, still marked by the shadow of everything that had happened. But they were honest in a way our relationship had never been before. We weren't best friends. Maybe we never would be. But we were relearning how to be sisters, and that was enough. "Have you heard from Dad?" Lydia asked cautiously as we walked to the cafe down the street. "He sent another letter last week. I haven't opened it." Our father had taken a plea deal after the criminal investigation concluded 3 years of probation. 500 hours of community service at organizations serving low-income residents, full restitution to the community fund, including interest, and a permanent ban from holding any position involving fiduciary responsibility. His wife had quietly divorced him, taking half of what little was left after legal fees and restitution were paid. He now lived alone in a small flat across town. Pastor Ruth had mentioned to me that he had started attending Sunday services, always sitting in the very back pew, always leaving immediately after the final hymn, without speaking to anyone. "Consequences are their own teachers," Ruth had said. "He is learning what your mother tried to teach him for 30 years, that integrity matters, that character is built in private, long before it is tested in public." I kept his letters in a box in my wardrobe, most of them unopened. I wasn't ready to read his words, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. I had no relationship with him, and I couldn't imagine what one would even look like at this point. But I had made my peace with the fact that his choices were his to live with his consequences, his to face. I didn't need to forgive him to be free of him, and that realization was a kind of freedom in itself. As Lydia and I sat in the cafe with little Rose sleeping peacefully between us, I thought about how much had changed in a year. Not just the external circumstances, the foundation, the recognition, the restored relationships, but the internal landscape. I knew who I was now. I knew my worth wasn't determined by my father's approval, or my sister's theft, or anyone else's definition of success. They say time heals all wounds, but I've learned that's not quite true. Time reveals who is willing to do the work of healing, and who would rather just wait for the pain to fade without ever addressing its source. Healing takes action, it takes honesty, it takes the courage to face uncomfortable truths and change in response to them. And that work, I've discovered, is never really finished. It just gets easier with practice. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, marked as high importance, and sent from an address I didn't recognize: the planning committee for the National Women's Professional Development Conference. They wanted me to give the keynote address at their annual conference in London, a 3-day event with 5,000 in-person attendees and an expected 50,000 watching the live stream. The proposed topic took my breath away. From invisible to undeniable, reclaiming your narrative after a professional setback. I stared at the invitation for a full 10 minutes, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Public speaking had never been my strength. I was a strategist, someone who worked best behind the scenes, crafting campaigns and analyzing data, not someone who stood in front of thousands of people delivering inspirational speeches. The thought of being on that stage, exposed and vulnerable, made my hands tremble. That night, I called Pastor Ruth, needing her wisdom to talk me down from my fear. She laughed when I told her about the invitation, not unkindly, but with genuine delight. "Your mother once told me that you were afraid of your own voice. This was years ago when you were still in secondary school. She said, 'Ruth Gillian has so much to say, but she's learned to be quiet because speaking up in our house only brings criticism. But when she finally speaks, when she's ready, the world had better listen, because she won't waste words. This is your moment to prove her right.'" I spent 3 weeks writing and rewriting the speech, filling my flat with crumpled drafts and late nights fueled by too much tea and sheer determination. I wanted to honor not just my own story, but the stories of all the women who had walked through the foundation's doors. The accountant, who was dismissed as too emotional when she reported harassment. The engineer whose innovations were consistently credited to male colleagues. The teacher who sacrificed her career for her family and was told she was no longer relevant when she tried to return. The morning of the conference, I stood backstage in London wearing a navy blue suit and my mother's cross necklace, listening to my introduction being read to 5,000 women in a convention hall, knowing 50,000 more were watching from their homes and offices. My hands were shaking, my mouth was dry. But when my name was called and I walked onto that stage, something shifted inside me. I looked out at the sea of faces, saw women of all ages and backgrounds, and I realized they weren't here to judge me. They were here because they saw themselves in my story, because they had experienced their own versions of invisibility and were hoping I could show them a way back into the light. I began to speak, my voice steadier than I expected. They called me a loser at my sister's wedding. I began, and the room went dead silent. In front of 200 guests, my own family reduced me to a punchline. The unemployed failure, the shame of the family, and you know what? They were right about one thing. I was a loser, but not in the way they meant it. I paused, letting it sink in before I continued. I lost the old version of myself that believed their lies about my worth. I lost the need for their approval that had shaped every decision I'd made for 37 years. I lost the fear of being alone, the fear that had kept me silent when I should have spoken up. And in losing all of that, I found something infinitely more valuable. I found myself. For the next 40 minutes, I told my story with unflinching honesty. But I focused less on the personal betrayal and more on the systemic issues that enabled it. I talked about work cultures that reward visibility over substance, where the person who speaks loudest in meetings gets the credit, regardless of where the ideas originated. I talked about family dynamics that pit women against each other, teaching us that love is a competition with only one winner. I talked about the pressure women face to stay quiet, to keep the peace, to make ourselves smaller, so that others can feel bigger. We are taught that speaking up about injustice within our families makes us difficult. I said, my voice growing stronger with every word. That reporting theft in the workplace makes us not a team player. That demanding credit for our own work makes us selfish. But silence has a cost. My silence cost me years of my career, my reputation, and nearly my self-worth. The silence my mother chose to protect me cost her peace in her final months. Silence always has a price, usually a higher one than speaking ever could. When I finished, the applause started instantly and grew into a standing ovation that lasted for a full 4 minutes. I stood on that stage with tears streaming down my face, watching thousands of women get to their feet, and I felt something crack open in my chest, not breaking, but breaking free. Afterwards, women lined up to speak to me for over 2 hours. Some were crying, some were angry. Many were just grateful. They shared stories of stolen credit, silenced voices and careers derailed by the very people who should have been supporting them. A woman in her 60s told me she'd been left off a research paper that ended up being the key to a colleague's tenure. A woman in her 30s explained how her business partner had filed patents for their inventions in his name only. Story after story, woman after woman, all saying some version of, "Thank you for making me feel less alone." On the flight home the next day, I got an email from the publisher who had reached out a year earlier. They wanted to follow up about a book proposal, my story combined with practical guidance for women navigating professional betrayal and family sabotage. They offered an advance that would fund the foundation's operations for 2 years. I accepted on one non-negotiable condition: all of my proceeds would go to the Rose Foundation. The publisher agreed immediately. As the plane began its descent, my phone buzzed with a message from Lydia. "Watched your speech online. I am so proud of you, Jill. And I am so sorry I ever made you fight to be seen. You were always the strong one. Love, Lydia." It was the first time in over a decade she had signed a message with the word love. I didn't reply right away. I just sat with it, soaking in the feeling of being seen, of being heard, of being valued, not in spite of my story, but because of it. Strong enough to speak my truth, and generous enough to help others find theirs. I'd spent 37 years learning to be quiet, so others could be loud. But that conference taught me that my voice had never been weak. It had just been waiting for a permission I didn't need to give myself. 3 years after that speech in London, the Rose Gillian Foundation, renamed at the board's insistence to include my name, was now operating in 4 cities across the region. We had helped over 1,000 women rebuild their careers, secured £2 million in grants, and employed a staff of 15 people who all shared my mother's vision of quiet, persistent kindness, turned into systemic change. My book, The Woman They Called a Loser, had become an unexpected bestseller, featured on morning television shows, and selected by book clubs across the country. Publishers Weekly called it a masterclass in turning pain into purpose. I was 40 now, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized, from the woman who had worn a cheap dress to her sister's wedding, absorbing humiliation as if it were her birthright. I was confident in ways I'd never imagined possible, comfortable in my own skin, unshakable in my self-worth. Most importantly, I was at peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep peace that comes from facing hard truths and surviving them. I still ran the foundation, but I had hired an excellent executive team that handled the day-to-day operation, freeing me up to focus on strategic growth and the speaking invitations that continued to pour in. David and I had been together for 2 years, and we had recently started talking seriously about marriage. He'd proposed last month over dinner at the little Italian restaurant, where we'd had our first date, and I had said yes without a moment's hesitation. My life wasn't perfect. No life ever is. But it was mine, built on truth, instead of borrowed time, shaped by my choices, instead of someone else's theft. On what would have been my mother's 71st birthday, I drove to Riverside Memorial Cemetery with a bouquet of white roses and a box of freshly baked cinnamon rolls, still warm from the oven. I had made them that morning using her recipe, the one Lydia and I had made together in our old kitchen 3 years ago. It had become my tradition on her birthday to bring her the thing she loved most, the food that had always been her language of love. When I arrived at her grave, I was surprised to find I wasn't alone. Lydia was already there, standing by the headstone, with 9-month-old Rose sleeping peacefully in a carrier against her chest. Beside her, 2-year-old Grace, Lydia's second daughter, born healthy and strong, 18 months after Rose was carefully placing dandelions she'd picked from the grass at the base of the headstone. We stood together in silence for a long moment, 2 sisters who had spent most of their lives as strangers, but were now slowly, carefully learning to be family. Grace looked up at me, her eyes wide, and said, "Auntie Jilly," then went back to arranging her dandelions with the serious focus only a toddler can possess. "I bring the girls here once a month," Lydia said quietly, her hand resting protectively on little Rose's back. "I tell them stories about their grandma. The real stories, not the sanitized version Dad would have preferred. I want them to know that women can be flawed and make mistakes and still be heroes. That Grandma Rose chose silence when she should have chosen courage, but she found a way to give her daughter courage, even after she was gone. That being a good person doesn't mean being perfect. It means trying to be better than you were yesterday. I felt tears prick my eyes. Mum would have loved that. She would have loved them. I think she'd be proud of us, Lydia said. Both of us for different reasons, but proud. Before I could answer, I heard footsteps behind us and turned to see a young woman approaching hesitantly. She was maybe 25, dressed in jeans and a blazer, clutching a folder to her chest, like a piece of armor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice nervous but determined. "Are you Gillian Lowe?" "I am," I replied, wondering if she was the journalist, a donor, or someone seeking help from the foundation. "My name is Madison Shen. I'm starting at the foundation next week as a program coordinator. I just wanted to introduce myself and say," her voice broke, "your book changed my life. I was in an abusive work situation where my supervisor took credit for everything I did and made me feel like I was crazy for thinking it was wrong. Reading about how you fought back, how you refused to be silent, even when your own family tried to bury you, it gave me the courage to leave, to report him, to start over. I just wanted to say thank you." I stepped forward and hugged this stranger, who was somehow family connected by the invisible thread of women helping women survive the systems designed to diminish us. "Welcome to the family, Madison. I'm looking forward to working with you." She left with tears in her eyes and hope on her face, and I thought about how many Madisons were out there in the world, how many women needed someone to show them that surviving wasn't the same as thriving, that they deserved more than just to endure. That night, I sat in my office at the foundation long after everyone else had gone home. The walls were covered in the evidence of the life I had built. Photos of my mother, pictures of the women we'd helped at their new jobs, or holding diplomas from training programs, newspaper clippings about the foundation's expansion, and framed magazine covers featuring my book. But my eyes always returned to one specific frame on my desk, the one that made visitors ask questions. It was a screenshot of Lydia's social media post from 3 years ago, the one from her wedding, where she had called me an unemployed loser. I'd had it professionally printed and framed, not as a trophy or a wound, but as a reminder. The woman in that story, the one being humiliated in front of hundreds of people, was real. She existed. She suffered, and she survived, and became something those people never imagined possible. My phone rang, and I saw it was a producer from a major television network asking if I would consider being the subject of a documentary series about my story. I listened politely, and then just as politely declined. I had told my story enough times in the book, in speeches, in interviews. It was time to step back and let other women tell theirs, to use the platform I'd built to amplify voices that had been silent for too long. After I hung up, I took out my journal, the leather-bound notebook I'd started after my mother died. Writing had become my way of processing, of making sense of the journey from that humiliating wedding to this moment of hard-won peace. I wrote, "They used to call me a loser. For years I believed them. I let their definition of success become my yardstick, and by that measure I failed completely. But my mother taught me something they never understood. Losing everything society values can be the first step to gaining what actually matters: integrity, purpose, and peace. They still call me just different words now. Ms. Director, Author, Boss, Keynote Speaker. But the only title that ever really mattered was the one Mum gave me, daughter, and I have made her proud. I know I have, because I can feel it in the legacy she left in the foundation that bears her name, in the 1,000 small acts of courage from women who read my story and found their own strength. I closed the journal, turned off the office lights, and locked the door behind me. I drove home, not to the small flat where I had lived through the darkest days, but to the house David and I had bought together last year, the one with a kitchen big enough for baking and a garden where we planned to plant roses in the spring. He was waiting for me with dinner warm in the oven and a smile that reminded me every day that I was worthy of uncomplicated love, the kind that didn't require me to shrink myself or strive for better or earn it through achievement. That night, lying in bed with David sleeping beside me and the moonlight filtering through the curtains, I thought about the long, unlikely journey from that wedding to this moment. I thought about my mother's video message, Pastor Ruth's guidance, Marcus Greison's unexpected intervention, Emma's journalism, every small choice that had brought me here. They used to call me a loser, and now they call me unstoppable. But the truth is, I was always both. I just had to lose everything I was told was important before I could find what truly was. And that is where Gillian's story brings us today, from the woman they called a loser at a wedding, to the founder of a movement that has helped over 1,000 women rebuild their lives. Her journey wasn't about revenge. It was never about making her family suffer the way they made her suffer. It was about something far more powerful, reclaiming her truth, her value, and her right to exist on her own terms. What strikes me most about Gillian's story is how universal it is. Maybe you've never had your work stolen by a sibling, but perhaps you've felt invisible in your own family. Maybe you've never been publicly humiliated at a wedding, but you've had that moment where someone you trusted reduced your worth to nothing. Maybe you've never lost your career to caregiving, but you have surely sacrificed something important and watched others benefit from that loss. Gillian's story resonates because it touches on something we've all felt the pain of being underestimated, overlooked, or erased by the people who are supposed to love us. But here's the thing I want you to take away from this. Gillian didn't win by becoming like the people who hurt her. She won by refusing to let go of her integrity, even when integrity felt like the most expensive thing she could possibly afford to keep. She won by choosing truth over convenience, justice over revenge, and ultimately mercy over hate. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Have you had your work stolen, your contributions ignored, or your value questioned by family or colleagues? How did you handle it? Did you find your voice, or are you still searching for it? Let me know in the comments below. Your story matters, and this community is here to support you. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own journey, or if it inspired you to take back your own narrative, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This channel is dedicated to sharing stories of real people facing real challenges and finding real courage. Stories like Gillian's remind us that we are not alone, that survival is possible, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to let others define who we are. Thank you for listening to Gillian's story. Thank you for being a part of this community. And remember, you are not what they said you are. You are who you choose to become.